Hello, everyone. Salam. It's really, really wonderful seeing you all, and it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you here to this roundtable on knowing war, knowledge ecologies, and imperialism. I would like to thank you for making the time to be here in person and soon also joining us virtually, Shahid. It's truly an honor to be in conversation with you and to think alongside you. I would like to thank my colleagues in the Duke University Middle East Studies Center and for their support, Erin and Griffin, who have been like extremely supportive in all sorts of ways. I would like also to thank our co-sponsors for this roundtable. I sincerely thank the Franklin Humanities Institute, the UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, African and African American Studies, Cultural Anthropology, International Comparative Studies, and History. So, yeah. 10 years ago, I became a student of Afghanistan, and believe me when I tell you that it is not easy to find supervisors in what we come to know as the field of Afghanistan studies today. I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and wanted to research contemporary women artists in Kabul and understand how contemporary art places emerge and develop in a war-torn city such as Kabul. My resources then were online articles, mostly from mainstream media outlets and event archives, and a contact to Rahra Omerzad, the founder of the Center Contemporary Art Afghanistan. The people I talked to and I was surrounded by in London, and this is before entering field work, and who had traveled to and worked in Afghanistan were amongst others white British aristocrats and academic elites closely related to the Royal Academy and the BBC, former English soldiers turned into documentary filmmakers, war photographers, war journalists, researchers who made their living as consultants in Afghanistan, and Afghan American artists and Afghan policymakers working in the field of development. Within this, what I now refer to imperial epistemological ecosystem, the term war was usually not used, and this was in 2014. I did doubt myself a lot. In hindsight, it felt like gaslighting, as no one was around me to talk about war and occupation, but the terms being used were peace building, development, and reconstruction. If it was not for the writing of Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, who is with us today, I'm really, really excited that the only one who came actually from outside of North Carolina, I would have not dared to believe my guts and observations as a 24-year-old student without any other reference point and before working, researching, and living in Afghanistan myself. It was only when I first traveled to Kabul in November 2015 and was standing in front of the closed doors of the Center Contemporary Art Afghanistan, because Omerzad had left to study for his master's in Norway, that I began to learn about the offline life that I will get back to shortly. Officially, in December 2014, the US was withdrawing troops, while at the same time the bilateral security agreement allowed the US to keep its soldiers in a non-combatant role in Afghanistan after 2014. The NATO would be active on the ground in a non-combatant role, training the Afghan security forces that they at times refer to as partners, allies, or friends of the international community during the so-called Resolute Support Mission that began in 2015. And in their role as allies, friends, and partners of the US heading NATO in Afghanistan dropped in April 2017 the most powerful conventional bomb ever used in combat, the GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast, known unofficially as the mother of all bombs, or MOAB. Investigative journalist Lindsay Billing made her way to the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province, where she documented witness accounts from the village Asad Khel and writes in an article published in autumn 2023, and I quote, "When Wali and his neighbors returned to their village, they found that their land did not produce crops like it had before. It was devastated," he says, "by the bomb's blast radius that reached as far as the settlement of Shadle Bazar, over a mile and a half away. Wali said, "We would get 150 kilograms of wheat from my land before, but now we cannot get half of that," he says. We came back because our homes and livelihoods are here, but this land is not safe. The plants are sick and so are we. End of quote. These are the tangible ecological transformations that pose serious questions for researchers around the relation between empirical and archival research and discursive analysis in the face of such horrific devastation and destruction. There is dire need to build wider knowledge networks, thinking alongside artists, researchers, scientists, and laborers and survivors to render the geotemporal particular manifestations of knowledge, ecologies, and imperialism visible that are so hard to access. In terms of methods and methodologies, working with the living comes with different challenges compared to working with the dead and archives that I would love for us to discuss further today. And I quote here Bernadette Vicuña González, gaps and silences of the archive that González writes about in Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper, can house myriad speculations, other versions of the story. This story then is shaped by the tensions between the archive and the desires it stirs up and confounds. Perhaps the story that emerges from these tensions, incomplete, unsatisfying, and riddled with silences, absences, and refusals, might be enough. End of quote. In my own work, I introduced the analytic war mode of production as an entry point to offer new ways of theorizing race and labor and present-day structures of war and capitalism. Drawing on anti-colonial Marxist, socialist, and feminist and queer theory, as well as empirical research from 2015 to 2021, alongside Afghans in Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, I try to understand the geotemporal particularities of labor processes and racialization in the war mode of production in Afghanistan during NATO's war and occupation from 2001 to 2021. To do so, I center the aesthetic, manual, and effective labor of Afghan men in Kabul. By attending to how cis male artists and cultural workers work in the war mode, I hope to show how the war mode produces and exacerbates class differences that hierarchize and conditionalize the value of racialized Afghan labor power, and show the different places that Afghan labor power inhabits in work relationships organized by carceral states and systems in Europe and the Anglosphere, as well as in West Asia, and that determine how Afghans differently experience confinement to Afghanistan and access to outward migration, as land, water, and air harms the people who live of it as a result of protracted empire building by way of war. However, it is extremely difficult to speak to research about Afghanistan apart from exceptions I mentioned, such as Hanifi's brilliant work in the age of the neoliberal university, and also how do we talk actually to subjects of empire who are in an ongoing, intimate, and in an ongoing relationship with empire by way of work, but also through other non-material ways of labor that they share. In discursive ecosystems of the neoliberal university, we as researchers inhabit contradictory places. Roderick Ferguson reminds us how institutions of US empire in the 20th century, and I quote, began to see minority difference in culture as positivities that could be part of their own series of aims and objectives. End of quote. This brings me to the question of how to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on the stolen land of several indigenous nations, including the Tutelo and Saponi-speaking peoples on Turtle Island, in a generative way. How do I think alongside Black and indigenous knowledges as a dual citizen of Iran and Germany, and speaking to you now as a settler colonial subject, in a way that does not cater to the perverting logics of US intelligence services that we know are also omnipresent in area studies? Is it even possible to speak and think alongside Black and indigenous studies in ways that do not harm but are generative, I ask, as I work and think within and against the logics of Middle East and South Asia studies? I'm saying this in a moment and in a time when academics and neoliberal universities are pushing within area studies to think about entanglements that expose the need for different ways to think about how we navigate citational politics. At the same time, I see researchers and programs such as the New University in Exile Consortium instrumentalizing indigenous feminism by using it to frame Afghan and Iranian women in Iran and Afghanistan as indigenous warriors in their struggle against what they describe as theocratic states, referring to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the Islamic republics are obviously supporters of Palestine, and in public life of Afghan and Iranian diasporas in particular, the struggle against the occupation in Palestine is equated with support for the Taliban and Revolutionary Guards. How do we detangle these sort of perversions? The psychopathic expressions of the Israeli occupation forces and settlers, the gaslighting of German political elites, and monstrosity of the military-industrial complex that is the largest polluter of water, soil, and air worldwide, demand of us to develop theoretical and comparative frames of analysis that can capture particularities and features of carceral capitalism in the stage of neoliberalism that are inherently perverting and its devastating ramifications for planetary systems and human and non-human life on it. So, about the structure of today's roundtable, we will have 2 fabulous roundtable sessions with you beautiful folks. Each session will be about an hour long. We had another cancellation this morning, so we have more time for discussion. But I will still keep the 3 folks who didn't make it in the loop, and also for everyone who is not a participant, I hope like Zina, Maria, Zach, like we can continue also the conversation and think about, you know, how you relate to the things that we discuss and how it speaks also to your work, right? So it's just a beginning for hopefully like a long-term connections that we can build. Whatever, I mentioned the panel discussion. In the last hour, we can connect the conversations then across the panels, and I did consciously not share more questions apart from the roundtable descriptions that you received to see what sort of connections we build organically through our conversations and the questions that emerge, and I hope that makes sense. So the first roundtable session is going to be with Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, Anta Storti, and Shahid Abu Salama. And the second roundtable session will be with Charles Kurtzman, Miguel Rojas Sotelo, and Sharon Kunde. And I do not want things to be too formal, as you might saw from my initial remarks. So it would be fantastic if everyone could then maybe now introduce themselves if you like, and however you like to introduce yourself. Maybe you like to mention institutional affiliations, maybe you don't, maybe it's not important. So I leave this up to you. Fanis Musavi, at the moment speaking here as postdoctoral fellow at the Duke University Middle East Studies Center.
I'm Charlie Kurzman from Sociology and wrote at UNC Chapel Hill.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Anna Storti. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm at Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies here at Duke.
I'm Zach Capel. I'm visiting scholar from Northwest University in New York.
I work in Orlando with DUMESC.
I'm from the librarian for Middle East Studies.
I'm Maria. I'm postdoc in political psychology.
I'm Dina, she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate in the literature program.
I'm Shah Mahmoud Hanifi from James Madison University, and I apologize for our basketball performance. Thought I should mention. Yeah.
What even meant, like, okay.
You should talk.
Yeah. Yeah. You reminded me of the brackets I filled out. It has been bad. I'm at the bottom of the list. Thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful being with you here. So some brief notes about the special issue or special section, depending on journals, they use different terms for it, that I hope we can work towards, but also thinking about different platforms, right? While obviously there is urgency to think about these issues within the academic context, for me an ongoing question is also how to make these issues legible for actually wider audiences and different platforms, right? But yeah, so I've been in conversation with comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and the according to the journal guidelines, they request a brief proposal, which includes, amongst others, a brief outline, theme, and theoretical or comparative framework, and brief abstracts for each essay, about 150 words each, and including the editor's introduction, and then it would be reviewed. So if you're interested in this, also like the auditor, like Zach, Dina, and Maria, let's stay in touch and talk and think about, what makes sense to everyone and if it resonates with you. About recording and pictures, our wonderful colleague Rhiannon is here, and if it is it okay for everyone if she takes pictures? This is, yeah? Yeah, Chelsea? No. I mean, if you're not okay, you can just maybe, let her know, so we just know that we do not use your photos. That's absolutely fine. And for the purposes to share this among ourselves, as well as then with the folks who didn't make it, we would record the audio of the event. Is that okay with everyone? Does everyone feel comfortable? Yeah? Okay, cool, thank you. Without further ado, let us delve into the first session. Thank you so much for listening. Please join me in welcoming Shah Mahmood Hanifi, who starts off the first roundtable session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Paniz. I want to make it known how much I've benefited from my interaction with Paniz. I find her to be one of a great consortium of really, really promising, powerful young scholars that are going to change the way Afghanistan is thought about. And I've just really, I'm just grateful to be here and to participate. I've taken the liberty of sending like a little draft paper around to the people on our official participant list. Sean, I'm so happy to meet you now. I had your email, so I just sent you my little paper. And if anyone else, I would be happy to send this thing around. If Paniz, you know the emails for everyone here, just please send it to them. And really, my hope is to get some help in my problem. And maybe I'll just state my fundamental problem. First of all, I'm concerned about war and the environment in Afghanistan. And this is new terrain for me. I am a historian who was typically, kind of doing social history and economic history things. And I wandered into the environment when I realized I wrote a book about the camel trade, caravan sort of transformations under colonialism, but I knew nothing about the camel. And it was really humiliating because there's so much to learn about the camel. And it was through the camel sort of connection to Afghanistan that I ended up in Australia looking for Afghans, and there's a whole camel history in Australia. And before I knew it, I was thinking about other animals, elephants, and the horse has been so kind of dominant in the history of Afghanistan. I just gradually realized I'm in trouble. And I've got to learn about these things late in my career. So I feel like I'm speaking not out of turn, but with absolutely no authority or expertise on some of the things I'm saying. So I'd like to be corrected and helped in my conclusions about the environment. And my main problem with the study of the environment in Afghanistan is the nature of the data. And I think that's maybe what I'm trying to address in this paper and elsewhere. It's the issue really of not just war data, and we all know wars are kind of contextualized by a tremendous amount of censorship and propaganda and information management. And that's, I guess, simple. But war has become more complex, particularly after 2001, with the sort of covertization of warfare, and the also the outsourcing contractors. So it's like contractors and covert operations who are so active and prominent, so destructive of the cultural and physical landscape of Afghanistan. I want to track their crimes. And I'm stuck against data barriers, intelligence data barriers. And I know this is a really complex thing because you can, I know there are certain release, I know there are ways around these barriers, and I'm really here to try to get some help in circumventing some of these security and intelligence barriers to the scope of warfare. And because Afghanistan has, as you so nicely put it, Penny, it's been subject to sort of a humanitarian invasion as well. I know there's important interstices between the covert contracting intelligence worlds and kind of the public face of the occupation. And those interstices may be the place where I can find my way to the data I'm seeking. But I think it will require different kinds of activities and initiatives. And maybe that's sort of something for later. But maybe I'll just sort of try to summarize this paper for a few minutes. As a historian, it took me a long time to realize how interested colonial and imperial actors were in the environment. I kind of always thought it was politics and the economy. And as I started rereading some of the sort of foundational literature on Afghanistan, it became really clear to me that the sort of colonial knowledge production about Afghanistan was predicated on environmental realities, in the sense that the first sort of entree for the British to get to know Afghanistan was really the Indus River and the plans for a great transformation of Indus River and Indus Basin markets and commercial activity. And the plan, there's a great book by a guy named Clive Dewey, who's got a beautiful illustrated book about steamships on the Indus. And it's like a multi-decade project of trying to get big steamers up the Indus. And, ultimately the faith in technology failed, but it just speaks to the point that the Indus River was really central to the framing of British India. And what, of course, that's now Pakistan, a separate story. But that's the initial sort of encounter with Afghanistan, coming through the Indus River in the early 19th century. And that really leads to the first war. And the first Afghan war is talked about in ways that are really mythologized and misleading. There's sort of a seminal myth about a sole survivor of the Afghan war. There's pictures and sort of this guy's celebrated as the sole survivor of the first British occupation of Afghanistan. And what's missed is the army of retribution. That was an incredibly vengeful and violent affair. And it just speaks to the beginning of imperial criminality in Afghanistan. And that's how I'm kind of framing my paper, as just a series of imperial war crimes on the environment of Afghanistan. And just to sort of summarize the British knowledge production about Afghanistan through the environment, that first war was in 1839 to 42, and the way it ended led to a real hands-off, back-away approach. There's not a tremendous amount of data until the second war gets up and running in the 1870s, mid-1870s, late 1870s. The formal dates of the war are 1878 to 80. But at that time, the British began focusing on the Hindu Kush and mountains and routes through the Hindu Kush passes, particularly to and from Kabul. And in a sense, the Hindu Kush got mapped onto British colonial knowledge in the context of war. And just to speak to the decimation of those, the crimes against those mountains, the mother of all bomb is maybe the epitome of a crime against the Afghan mountains. and the people that inhabit them. But then the sort of conclusion for making Afghanistan, and it really is important to emphasize that when the British first got involved in India, there was no Afghanistan. It was the Kingdom of Kabul, and the British manipulation of India and its frontiers led to the making and bordering of Afghanistan as we know it. And those borders took shape in the last third of the 19th century. And they kind of, like I say, although it's not a border, the Indus River begins the mapping of Afghanistan, and the mapping of Afghanistan really concludes with the northern region, where the Oxus River borders what was perceived by that time as the Russian Empire. And so the so-called, which is so misleading, the great game of Afghanistan between Britain and Russia about Afghanistan had a lot to do with the Oxus River. And so kind of that's just the way I'm now seeing colonial knowledge production through its various phases, through these environmental fetishes, maybe. And, you know, there's a third Afghan war in the 20th century, in 1919, that's known as the War of Independence, which is a real problematic framing because I'm starting to realize how, first of all, when you claim to be independent, there's never addressing what you're becoming independent from. So the colonial dependencies are not addressed in the national narrative that celebrates independence first. But independence really perpetuated and intensified colonial and imperial engagement of Afghanistan. It really opened the door to a number of other powers besides the British, which actually really continued active engagement in Afghanistan after independence, so to speak. There is a great book by Max Dreyfall called The Coloniality, titled Coloniality, that sort of addresses continuing British engagement of Afghanistan through the new embassy. The largest embassy in Asia is created by the British in Afghanistan after independence. It's so large that it had an airfield for the first air evacuation of people in the world in 1929, when there was a revolt that led to the, again, air evacuation of the British legation. The point about independence is that it's not just the British who intensified their activities. It's now the French and the Germans and the Japanese and the United States, eventually Czechoslovakia, Australia. The whole world had a hand, really, in Afghanistan in some form after independence. And the particularly impactful environmental activities of these new powers, it involved just a surge in kind of road building and dam building and bridge building and new sort of mineral contracts, oil exploration, new global markets for lapis lazuli, and a real opening of Afghanistan's environment to development or exploitation by a number of powers. And the United States becomes the primary actor in this constellation of actors after World War II, when the primary environmental competitors and political competitors are the Soviet Union, of course, and the United States. And they both undertake substantial projects that greatly impact the environment of Afghanistan. Mainly the Soviets building dams and roads and grain silos in the north, and the Americans in the south in the Helmand Valley. And the data for the point is that now there's a sort of the question of data about the environment. And really the most shocking thing to me is that from what I can tell, and Penny's maybe can correct me, there doesn't seem to be any even fleeting engagement in the Afghan national historiographic context about the environmental impact of these foreign contractors and contracts throughout the 20th century. it's sort of a silence, an Afghan historiographical silence that's mirrored in the silence about the colonial impact on Afghanistan. So, on the one hand, the Afghan records must be extensive, and they need to be used to really get a full understanding of what went on with the environmental projects. Now, the other side to the data coin here is that all of these foreign actors gathered tons of quantitative and qualitative and visual information, mapping, satellite imagery, really a tremendous amount spread in archives all around the world, public, private archives, government, university, just a global dispersion of data regarding the environment of Afghanistan. And in the context of the United States, there's a huge volume of official US government as well as major corporate actors. The Morrison Knudsen Company that was involved really in major projects in the West, the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, other really kind of seminal projects in the West, American West. And those knowledges about irrigation and big damming, of course, went global, and TVA authorities kind of in India and Pakistan navigating Indus water treaties and that kind of thing. And that's the same case for Afghanistan. And that's also just dramatically underutilized. The available information in the United States about Afghanistan is drastically underutilized. How much time do I have, Anise? Would you like me to continue? I'll take whatever I have.
No, I think we do have enough time, like, please.
Yeah. I do want to make a segue now to Duke. And this is a really significant institution that had a very prominent role in, and maybe still does, in Afghanistan. And that role is personalized, as so much of Afghanistan knowledge is sort of personalized, not institutionalized, if I could make that distinction. And the personality involved here is Louis Dupree, who is from this region. I know his homestead seems within a stone's throw from here. And we have some audience members who have been there. And the point about Louis Dupree is that he had a long-term, multi-decade, complicated presence and impact on Afghanistan. And it's often a celebrated impact. Louis Dupree wrote a lot. He wrote a big book called Afghanistan. Some of you may know it. It's online. It's been referred to, I've heard it referred to as the Bible for Afghanistan by diplomats. And it's a problematic text for a number of reasons that involve, let's just take, first of all, ethnicity. The ethnic map of Afghanistan has been the most damaging thing to the Afghan people that has ever been created. The ethnic map of Afghanistan has unleashed a genocidal violence among Afghans against each other around this imported idea of ethnicity. And we can discuss the details of that, but if you were to sort of look for images of Afghanistan, you'd see probably two famous images. One would, of course, be the Afghan girl. That is sort of the National Geographic epitome of the Orientalization of Afghanistan. And let me just say that the knowledge formation about Afghanistan is the most Orientalized body of knowledge that I have been exposed to. And Louis Dupree's a part of that. But this ethnic map was a construction, a multi-year construction by Louis Dupree and some local Afghan collaborators, including Ashraf Ghani, the recent president, former anthropologist, former Marxist anthropologist who ended up serving global capital. But Louis Dupree's role in Afghanistan, his public role writing books and making maps, was complemented by a covert intelligence role of sort of taking surreptitious pictures of intelligence installations, making little film drops in cemeteries late at night and crashing through gates, and a lot of nefarious activity. Some of Louis Dupree's translators were tortured and killed because of their service to Louis Dupree under the socialist regimes in Afghanistan. And Louis Dupree's legacy is really, really complicated for its overt and covert dimensions. For example, I'd like to know where Louis Dupree sent his intelligence reports. I don't know where they are. I'd like to get at them. In fact, some of Louis Dupree's public scholarship is kind of also hard to track in the sense that he was associated with this outfit known as the American University Field Staff, which is a really curious organization. If someone can tell me more about it, I'd love to learn. But it seems to be, and maybe I'll again go out on another limb, saying that this the American University Field Staff seems to have been subject to some incredible like web cleansing. I remember years ago looking for a lot of information about the AUFS online. In fact, Louis Dupree would have to send in reports, AUFS reports every year, and that's for 30 years. So there's hundreds of these reports that basically are the basis of his book. But the reports themselves, I've been working with Sean to try to get at them, and they, I don't know where they are. There's an institution, I forget, ICW, International, I'll get the acronym. There's a new institution that seems to subsume the AUFS. But Louis Dupree's career speaks to this combination of public and covert operations. And Louis Dupree's public work is well known and well celebrated, and the covert work is not addressed. And so Louis Dupree also has a wife, Nancy Dupree, and between them both, they have done a lot of influence and I would say intellectual damage in some ways, perpetuating ideas of ethnicity, particularly regarding Pashtuns. And just the nature of their presence, you know, they're anthropologists that don't speak the languages. It's ironic that Louis Dupree is introduced in the AUFS as an expert in Indo-European languages. And if you knew Louis Dupree, he didn't command any language in Afghanistan, nor did his wife, who is postured or claimed or presented to be the grandmother of Afghanistan, which is insulting. Afghan people don't need Nancy Dupree as our grandmother. And the imperial conceit in that framing is drenched with imperial conceit. And we can go on and on. There's a few individuals, personal people, that are the knowledge base of Afghanistan. If you needed to know anything about Afghanistan during the Cold War, you had to talk to Louis Dupree. You didn't go to school at Duke. You tried to find a few minutes with Louis Dupree. Louis Dupree never produced any students here at Duke, but he seemed to show up on everyone's dissertation committee as the outside observer. Never created students, just sort of tracked them. And he was the guardian for Peace Corps and Fulbright, and really influential in the knowledge production. But there's a couple other people, and I need to mention them. The first is Thomas Gutierrez at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where they have an Afghanistan Studies Center there. And that is a intelligence workshop. That's a covert intelligence workshop. And I'd like to, for example, it's the University of Nebraska Omaha that wrote those famous Mujahideen textbooks that one Kalashnikov plus two Kalashnikovs kills the Soviet Union kind of textbook stuff. That's been, but University of Nebraska is the publisher of those things. And the person there is Thomas Gutierrez. And this basketball stuff is relevant because Thomas Gutierrez became the president or director, whatever it's called, of the Afghan national basketball team. And that was an intelligence recruiting vehicle. Ashraf Ghani and Zalmay Khalilzad are veterans of the Afghan national basketball team under Thomas Gutierrez's direction. It's not a joke. It's not a joke. Basketball ended up serving intelligence purposes. So between, and what's interesting is that Thomas Gutierrez and Louis Dupree, from what I know, were never in the same room together. Never did anything together. They both had their little fiefdoms and their sort of institutes, and never did the two meet. Afghanistan studies is characterized by that disaggregation of individual people kind of doing their own thing. There's no real coordination in the knowledge production about Afghanistan. And I mean this globally as well. Currently, it's the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies with the president who is an advisor to General Petraeus, Thomas Barfield, another anthropologist in the intelligence business. Proud to be General Petraeus' consultant. I don't know how much money these people made in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan has been a moneymaker for corporations and people. Afghanistan, the knowledge of it's been commodified, and it's a major problem. Maybe I should end. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Thank you.
So should we just continue and then comments and questions and discussion? Would you like to continue?
Sure, thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful and transfixing to listen to. Thank you, Denise, for the invitation. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation and to listening, but I will go ahead and share a bit of what I've been working on. This is work that is part of the introduction to my first book, At the Intersection of Feminist and Queer Theory and Asian American Studies. A lot of the work is trying to acknowledge that, yes, American imperialism leaves these explicit impacts ranging from the rise of fascism, environmental collapse, various refugee crises. But I'm trying to think through the more obscured residues of American imperialism. So I hope that you will entertain me as I read from the introduction. So this section of the introduction begins with two epigraphs, and I will go ahead and read them. One is by Ocean Vuong in his 2019 novel On Earth We're Deeply Gorgeous. Let no one mistake us for the fruit of violence, but that violence, having passed through the fruit, failed to spoil it. The next epigraph is Franz Fanon from The Wretched of the Earth. Imperialism, which today is waging a war against a genuine struggle for human liberation, sows seeds of decay here and there that must be mercilessly rooted out from our land and from our minds. So for me, these two epigraphs steer us toward an exercise in juxtaposition. The first transports us to Vietnam and American invasion by way of Vuong's novel On Earth We're Deeply Gorgeous, which is a queer coming of age and refugee family history in the form of a son's letter to his mother, the daughter of a Vietnamese woman and a white American soldier. All this time I told myself we were born from war, but I was wrong, Ma. We were born from beauty. Let no one mistake us for the fruit of violence, but that violence, having passed through the fruit, failed to spoil it. Here is a passage that points toward diasporic possibility, a rupture that releases the body and its bloodlines ever so slightly from the hold of violence, which in this case takes the shape of war, the United States, and whiteness, different names for the same thing. The son, nicknamed Little Dog, confronts America's imperialist force with a sensorial recognition, pointing towards the body's ability to store past injury. Violence enters the fruit, but this arrival need not be a death sentence. While Vong's words do not supply the details of violence's escape, they reassure the reader that it can, in fact, depart, leaving the body intact. It enters, it passes, but even as this rendition of poetic justice fails to apply to every refugee story, Vong makes a world in which it is possible, overwhelming me with a series of questions. What must one do in order for the violence to pass through the fruit? If the fruit indeed is not spoiled, does it taste the same as it did before? I wonder about the undeniable smell of rotten fruit and where the violence goes when it leaves. Does it vanish, fade, or dissolve? Like sweat, does it evaporate from the skin, becoming salt waiting to be rinsed off? Or does it scour to find another and go in for the kill, like salt to a wound? For Vong, violence punctures us, but it can leave us too. And for scholars of queer and Asian diaspora, his words summon the unique injury ignited by the many arms of U.S. militarism, articulating a grief with the potential neither to transform nor transport, but rather to shift the gaze back towards us, which for him is an urgent lesson in survival. For Fanon, the mood is quite different. If Vong's characters are simultaneously touched and untouched by imperial violence, the subjects of his once band, The Wretched of the Earth, are instructed to be the sinner that sinks their teeth into violence, that forbidden fruit. Through a psychoanalytic inspection of colonialism, Fanon is famous for arguing that colonized populations, people who, in the colonizer's eyes and enforcement, exist outside the bounds of humanity and its moral codes, they must resist colonization through the only language the colonizer understands. Speaking specifically about Algerian struggle against French colonial rule in the mid-20th century, Fanon defends the use of violence as the only true counter to a dominant military presence. Of crucial importance, however, is his resolution that using violence to facilitate decolonization will prove incomplete unless the residue of violence is removed from within. Imperialism, which today is waging war against a genuine struggle for human liberation, sows seeds of decay here and there that must be mercilessly rooted out from our land and from our minds. Imperialism leaves behind seeds of decay. That is to say, violence enters the fruit. In raw detail, Fanon records what happens when it festers within. Briefly gorgeous, the wretched of the earth are susceptible to indelible wounds that mar and threaten to spoil the fruit. Like Vong, Fanon offers another lesson in life's prerequisites. Anticipating the power of nations that wield violence on a devastating scale means to become intimate with violence, learning its expanse, so to acknowledge how violence, like imperialism, leaves behind seeds of decay that one must mercilessly attend to, which, as my project seeks to clarify, is done perhaps by alleviating the tensions that stem from imminence of war. Folded into each page of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous are fragmented recollections of refugee life in Hartford, Connecticut, woven together as an ode to Vietnamese life. As readers, we learn of a family who made life in America following a war that lingered in memory and spirit. The matriarch of the family is the boy's grandmother, Lan, who worked as a sex worker for American GIs in Saigon. During those years, Lan had gotten pregnant from a white American client and gave birth to Rose in 1968. Asian with white heritage, Rose stood out among her peers. Due to her mixed race, the children called her Ghost Girl, called Lan a traitor and a whore for sleeping with the enemy. These children would cut Rose's auburn-tinted hair and rub feces on her face and skin to make her brown again, as if to be born lighter was a wrong that could be reversed. At 5 years old, that same girl watches from afar as her schoolhouse collapses in a napalm raid. Little Dog's mother never returns to school and never learns to read. By the time the family flees Vietnam for a refugee camp in the Philippines, it's 1990, and Rose is a wife with a baby boy, a little dog. Once the family obtained asylum, they were settled in Connecticut. And not long after, the son's father is imprisoned for beating his mother. Rose and Lon both exhibit signs of post-traumatic stress. The first time little dog remembers being hit by his mother, he was 4, and he was teaching her how to read. In other beatings, Lon, the grandmother, uses her body as a shield to protect her grandson from her daughter. When does a war end? The son writes. What do we mean when we say survivor? The war radically changes everyday life for Lon, Rose, and Little Dog, members of 3 different generations who witnessed and survived America's invasion of Vietnam. As Viet Thanh Nguyen has written, quote, all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. For war survivors, the intimacy of empire's violence persists even after asylum. Here, the battles forged in the memory of war show that memory is not simply a faculty of the mind, but an embodied affair. Too often examined by its source, occurrence, and longed-for aftermath, war and its violence defy a linear narrative. Prone to reproduction, this violence lodges itself within us as living subjects and as a culture, festering in spite of efforts to heal, which, while life-sustaining at times, tend to come up short. For those of us indebted to and in pursuit of social transformation, there is much yet to learn about what imperial violence can look like and feel like, how it lingers and how it may ripen into uncanny forms. To envision a world without war, one must first come to terms with the conceptual flight, which I stake as a central concern of my study. There is an intimacy to violence, and surviving violence, as we all have to varying degrees, means not that the violence has come to an end, but that it has begun a new trajectory, leaving the living with the burden to address what I term the intimacy of violence. A deceptively simple combination of words, the intimacy of violence theorizes the pervasiveness of violence through the language and practice of intimacy. Whereas intimacy conveys closeness, sexuality, and a method of connection, violence subsists through a much more excruciating variety. It can be described as colonial, imperial, state-sanctioned, epistemic, racist, sexual, gender, to name just a few, making it profoundly challenging to fully escape and account for. Resisting any easy definition, intimacy and violence both name amorphous relations. Brought together, the intimacy of violence extends an invitation to study violence through the ways it courses through patterns of intimacy, including romantic love, sexual desire, domestic living, national belonging, and other relations of closeness. More precisely, I propose it as a conceptual site to interrogate the long-standing effects of U.S. imperialism. Reading for the intimacy of violence costs deliberate attention on how the harms of the U.S. imperial past and present refuse conclusion, living on as a set of afflictions within the very bodies of empire's historical subjects. I'm interested in both examining how imperialism endures and tracing that endurance through the tensions that arise between Asianness and whiteness. The intimacy of violence, therefore, helps to assemble an archive of empire, a record of objects and subjects torn together that I have come to know quite intimately as a scholar who has devoted over a decade to searching through its files, and first and foremost as a member of the archival record itself. The intimacy of violence names an inventory of embodied, psychic, and affective impressions caused by imperialism, be it war, militarism, forced migration, displacement, or a nation's exclusionary laws. I pieced together this living archive to make the following argument. U.S. imperial expansion transpires not solely on the shores, land, and sea of America's territories or colonies, but through the everyday lives of its citizenry, and more strikingly, within the bodies of its subjects. So at base, I'm trying to argue that imperialism is both a quotidian and durational feature of social life. The intimacy of violence operates as a framework for understanding how and why empire refuses neat conclusion, and by drawing attention to empire's effects on the body, I strive to make clear how U.S. imperialism simultaneously produces and subsists through bouts of tension, unmitigated yet non-discriminating script moments of duress, strain, or inner striving that shift how race and sexuality are inhabited by survivors. So the idea that empire shapes the lives of its subjects is not an original position at all. I build upon a very rich tradition, particularly of queer feminist and Asian American theorists who have accounted for the ways minoritarian life has been subjected, negated, and annihilated by U.S. imperialism. What I seek to contribute to this is twofold. On the one hand, I focus on how imperialism cycles through the body. This is not to ignore the role of imperialism in seismically shifting the Earth's climate, refugee crises, and rising fascism, but to elevate embodiment as a key site for understanding the magnitude of U.S. empire and its role in such catastrophe. On the other hand, in calling attention to the more obscure remnants of the imperial past, such as the tensions felt by Rose, I do so with an interest not in recovering, reclaiming, or recuperating that past, but in tracing how one might otherwise attempt to contend with what oftentimes feels irreparable or incessant. I take as my point of departure the notion that racial mixture is an enduring social friction, despite growing acceptance in demographics of racially mixed people and families. From the starting point, I make a claim for the importance of understanding the lingering effects of imperial violence that translate again into physical, psychic, and affective tensions in the bodies of empire's subjects. And I will end by sharing one more example from our pages. So in this scene, it is late in the day, and Rose is settling in at home, lying face down on blankets spread on the floor as her mother Lon is straddling her back, kneading the knots and stiff cords from her shoulders after a long day at work. Rose's mother calls for her grandson to help her help his mother, and soon it is the two of them, one on each side of Rose, rolling out the hardened cords in her upper arms, wrists, fingers. You groaned with relief as we worked the muscles loose, unraveling you with nothing but our own weight. This muscular tension, certainly, most immediately, arises as a result of Rose's work at the nail salon, punching over for hours on end. But the knots and stiff cords that her mother and son helped to knead out result in a relief that is also, more pointedly, a sign of an intergenerational intimacy, where the tension, while not permanently relieved, is transformed. For a moment, almost too brief to matter, the son writes, this made sense, that three people on the floor, connected to each other by touch, made something like the word family. This scene illustrates the intimacy of violence as one of empire's quintessential attributes. Torn, a family is displaced from a homeland. Together, they navigate a new country with each other. There is isolation and intimacy, tension and violence. How might one seek to contend with these afflictions? One mode is to give language to the pain, and trauma has become one concept used both in clinical and mainstream spheres to encapsulate in an ending assortment of injury and suffering. Trauma is a pervasive feature of social life, and it's also critical to the way scholars have sought to understand the human condition. For psychoanalysis claims there is no easy elimination of trauma. Queer and feminist studies build upon perspectives gleaned from holistic therapies, which provide tools to learn how to acknowledge, accept, and live with trauma, recognizing the impossibility of eliminating it altogether. What I seek to account for, on the contrary, are the ways one might encounter trauma and all it stands in for, beyond the acts of preventing, eliminating, or adapting to it. How, in other words, do diasporic subjects touched by empire otherwise contend with the intimacy, the closeness of its violence? My focus ultimately is on how imperial subjects have sought to reconfigure the shape of empire's afflictions. So we can think here of the scene in Zong's novel. Three people on the floor connected to each other by touch made something like the word family. Here, Rose's muscular pain becomes an occasion for a familial intimacy, where tension is neither destroyed nor disavowed, but transformed, made into something that, as noted by the son, evokes family, but also calls to mind an embodied state of having been touched and torn by imperial contact, and yet together, as though to be torn is simply a sign of being part of something larger than oneself. Something that I would really love to talk about in the conversation whenever we open up to it is how we might even understand this moment a lot of the origins of this project stem from neoliberal multiculturalism. And I just don't even know if we're there anymore. I'm wondering, is there a way in which our world, I mean, is it just a fascist world, or are we living in maybe even neoliberal fascism? So, but I'll end there.
Do we have to push the button? Salam alaikum. Shahid, can you hear us? Oh, we cannot hear her. I just saw she's also wearing the red keffiyeh. Can you speak again, please? Hello? Salam, can you hear us? Oh, we cannot hear you. Can you hear us?
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Salam, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for
And it was great to hear some of you. Sorry to be late. How much time do I have?
You have you have 15 to 20 minutes because like several folks canceled. So yeah, you have 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay.
How is yours?
So it's great. Should I just go ahead, or is there like a particular question, or?
Maybe if you like to, we earlier in the introduction, everyone introduced themselves, but it's a very small and intimate and friendly group of people. And if you like, maybe we can all just quickly say our names and who's speaking here and listening to you. And then you can also introduce yourself if you like. So this is Panis.
Hi,
And then
Panis.
there is...
Khuda Hafiz. Are you actually Iranian?
Yeah, I was born in Tehran and raised in Germany. Unfortunately,
Khuda
Germany.
Hafiz.
Oh, you don't have to.
We don't have to? You can hear us? Sorry.
Hi, I'm Charlie Kurzman from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Hi, I'm
Nice to meet you.
I'm from Duke University.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Zina Falahian. I'm at Duke in the literature program.
Yes, hello. I'm Shah Mahmood Hanifi from James Madison University.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, I'm Zach Capel from Aarhus University in Denmark.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Sean Swanek from the librarian here at Duke University, one of the librarians at Duke.
Which direction should I look at? What?
She's at that camera that right beside the screen up at the top.
Oh, okay.
So if you
Hi.
guys will see. Yep.
Hello, I'm Maria, and I'm a postdoc here in culture anthropology at Duke.
Hi, Maria.
The floor is yours, Shahid.
So this round table was like trying to draw on intersections between war and ecology and
Imperialism, yeah.
imperialism. Yeah. I think I have. First, it's quite hard to meet you at those times. Like my family is literally facing the worst times possible. We didn't want to be in Spain. We are lucky to have been able to reunite with my parents in Spain. The rest are still in Cairo. We're like really dispersed. And of course, that's a story that is a direct result of imperialism that is thriving and very well alive and kicking as Palestine exposes it, and particularly Gaza these days. Because without this culture of imperialism and colonialism, we wouldn't have been here, and without the international inaction that condoned Israeli practices of settler colonialism and military occupation and apartheid, we wouldn't have been here. And the Palestinians have been warning since 1948 and even since before. I mean, let's not forget that actually that one of the most major civil disobedience strikes that was led by the Palestinians happened before Nakba and lasted for 4 years between 1936 and 1939, a revolution that we call the Great Arab Revolt, and it was against Zionist and British colonialism. And we've always been warning of the consequences, the devastating consequences that such supremacist ideology would have on Palestine, on the people, on the land. But the Palestinians were constantly silenced and demonized, and that's also another side, of course, of imperialism, another weapon that they use against us. They've used culture in order to dominate, and the Palestinians have constantly used culture in order to resist. And as a Palestinian born and raised in Jabalia refugee camp, I grew up engaging with all sorts of cultural expressions that were meant to basically try and cut through the colonial ideology and allow for our silenced stories to be heard, whether through drawings or song or dabke, the folk dance of the Levant and Palestine, and writing, literally every possible means. I felt in need really to use these spaces in order to survive and reclaim my humanity in the midst of a reality that was designed to dehumanize us in every possible term. So I speak to you with a very, very heavy heart. Israel has not only bombed my family home and left my family homeless and displaced, but also burnt our home. So they burnt everything, literally everything. So our family albums that go back to like 4 decades are all gone. Our trees, some of which that are older than me, are also bulldozed and burnt. Of course, Israel cannot exist in a vacuum, and Israel is a capitalistic project that wouldn't have survived without the support, financial and diplomatic and media support of the US and other imperial powers. I was holding this book in my hands called Light in Gaza. And in this book, I have, do you guys see it correctly? Or should I do something with my video settings?
Wonderful. Thank you for showing it to us. Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
I think this way you can read it better. So I'm just would like you to really read listening. Can you guys read this name? Allah يرحمه. رفعت العراعير. So this is only one of the projects that I've had the honor to participate with him and work with him on, and it's called Light in Gaza. And this book was also done in collaboration with AFSC, the Quakers, that is based in Chicago, I think. So you can guys access it where you are. It's published by Haymarket. It's incredible lives that we have where uncertainty really shapes your life, and you don't take your life for granted. You don't take your loved ones for granted. And we've learned that the hard way. And I'm hoping that Palestine is giving some lessons to the world, not to take anything for granted, even if they are not directly under falling bombs. We have to understand how interconnected we are. Palestine is at the receiving end of productions taking place in the global north, and the US, as you all know, is like the biggest contributor to oppression in the world, the biggest contributor as well to the contamination of our world, environmentally speaking, through its military and irresponsible commodification, and just they've ruined literally everything with their capitalistic mindset that has furthered settler colonialism and other systems of oppression just to secure its interests. And as I said, of course, we need to be acting with this consciousness that Israel wouldn't have had a leg to stand on without US support, particularly, but also other allies such as the UK, that holds the historical responsibility for the establishment of Israel. I wanted to read some. How much time am I left with?
How much?
If you can guys,
How much? Yeah, you can.
if you can guys help me with timekeeping, I would be really grateful, because
So to the being edited.
Okay.
Let's 5 minutes. How does that sound like?
5 minutes.
Is it generous?
Or all right. Well, okay, then I can't read everything, but okay. I think it would be nice to read from this section. So just to give you a bit more about my journey, I belong to the population of Gaza, the third generation refugees of Gaza, who grew up in the aftermath of the US mediated 1993 Oslo peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. With questions of return, land, and sovereignty pushed to the margins by the Gulf War of 1991, the same year when I was born, during a curfew that almost took my life and my mom's together, and my grandma, who had to leave through Jabalia refugee allays holding one lantern in one hand and literally a white flag in the other. And we've seen that scene repeatedly during those past 6 months, and the white flag didn't save their lives. So I am standing in front of you as a miracle, really, that I'm alive. So So back to Oslo, Edward Said had condemned the Oslo Accords as an instrument of Palestinian surrender, as Israel maintained the occupation while absolving itself of responsibility towards the occupied. Said concluded that the PLO will end up guarding the world's largest open-air prison, and he meant then Gaza. This is a very fascinating interview that I read for Edward Said, and he had already called Gaza in 1993 the world's largest open-air prison. So it just this only actually just reinforces the concept that I'm using here throughout this chapter, which I call permanent temporality. I'm talking about how our experience as Palestinians, how it repeats across generations, and how we feel like we are stuck in time. So permanent temporality is a concept used to describe the experience of exile for refugees in general, and it applies to Palestinian refugees in particular. Palestinian refugees live in refugee camps where they are locked in limbo, as if suspended in space and time, as they hold onto the right of return that remains firmly denied by the Israeli state. Although most of the world moved to the post-colonial formation after World War II, Palestinian refugees have been subjugated to a perpetual cycle of settler colonial violence since 1948, with no justice or accountability, which only reinforces this vicious cycle and denies the refugee camps' political status and social significance as spaces for reclamation. So the impact of the Oslo process was that it was almost a second Nakba, and actually many of the Nakba generations, many of the Nakba survivors called Oslo another Nakba. And it's because it has pushed questions of returned land and sovereignty to the margins, and the Palestinian refugees were left in the political wilderness. But basically by 2000, with the second Intifada erupting in the occupied territories, the Oslo Agreement was dead, and it was proven soon after. Really, it was brokered. It was proved to be delusional, divisive, politically and otherwise. Since the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian refugees who have long headed the front line of resistance from their dispersed exiles have been caught in the political wilderness, while Israeli settlements expand at an increasingly fast pace, imprisoning Palestinian communities into ever-shrinking pentastones under innovative strategies of repression and control. The hypocrisy underlying these peace negotiations is evident in the Gaza Strip, which Israel had already encircled with an electric fence in 1994 as part of the preparation for peace with the Palestinians. And this information was actually from a piece written by Ilan Pappé. So he was already Ilan Pappé at that time, thinking like of the contradictions underlying this so-called peace process, and saying that the Gaza Strip already exposes how it was did from cradle, basically. The mainstream discourse on Israel-Palestine remains in denial of the enduring injustices on the ground, as clearly demonstrated in the peace plan introduced in 22 and touted by some leaders of the US and even the Gulf states that were trying to legitimate this US sponsored deal called the deal of the century, which Israel dictated and the Trump administration sponsored with support from Arab dictatorships. This happened despite the flagrant, I don't know, it's incredible to read from this because it feels like already it needs an update now that we're living through this genocide that is still ongoing as we speak. But it's incredible. It's talking basically about what I wanted to speak about now. Like, we are literally stuck in time and we are facing our people again being forced to displacement and losing. I mean, we're talking about probably thousands of Palestinian families right now that are wiped out of civil registry, and the victory that the world is claiming in that just claimed in the United Nations with this recent resolution that passed thanks to the US abstention for one time. This is such a shame, and it is also reflective of how much the imperial culture is alive and kicking. I just can't believe that the world was talking after 6 months of genocide and ethnic cleansing unfolding in plain sight before the whole world. All they could do was basically secure 2 weeks, like even not secured. Nothing is secured. There's nothing that could be guaranteed with Israel because we know of the culture of immunity that they've enjoyed since their establishment. But the bar is just so low for Israel, for Palestine. It is so low and it's so unacceptable, especially as we're marking nearly 6 months of genocide. And I don't understand how all the nations of the world could join in these fancy rooms and speak about our suffering in abstraction and try and negotiate 2 weeks of calm as if like it's only they're making, basically assuming that it's only okay not to kill Palestinians while they're fasting or during Ramadan, but once Ramadan is over we can resume killing them, etc. Like, in what world, in what religion, in what world is this acceptable? This shouldn't be acceptable in any terms, and this should be fought with all of us, because no one is free while the Palestinians are unfree, and no one is safe while evil monsters like this are unleashed on the Palestinians with no mechanisms of accountability left to hold them and stop them from continuing to perpetuate these horrible atrocities. Yeah, I mean, I could stop here and maybe we could have a discussion later if you want to pick up on anything that I've said and you'd like me to go in more depth. in anything, I'm happy to do that. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you all,
listening.
Shahid, for Shahid, I'm just so sorry, and I want to thank you for making the time, for being here, and for sharing the time with us, considering, as you said, the genocide is ongoing, and the unspeakable, like unimaginable, imaginable and imaginable atrocities that neighbors and your loved ones are subjected to. I'm just incredibly sorry, and I thank you for being here and sharing this with us and the emotional labor that it takes. Like, I want to acknowledge it. And so in the introduction, basically, and the first, your fellow participants of this first roundtable sessions were Professor Anastordi and Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, who have been talking about questions of like the ways in which we come to know. I would maybe, how should we go ahead? Because now Shahid has not heard the first two participants, but maybe you both like to start off with questions, and as you speak, maybe the ways in which different themes, that speak also to the context of Palestine and the ongoing genocide, as well as the protracted project of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, speaks actually to Afghanistan, Vietnam, as well as other contexts of South Asia in which war and occupation of the US empire manifested in the 20th and 21st century in particular. Sorry, Shahid, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to ask something to my fellow academics.
Sure, تفضلي.
Shukran. I was like really curious about what you guys think about the paradoxes of the breakthroughs that we've had academically with settler colonial studies and decolonial studies, and how you understand, how you make sense of these breakthroughs when this is going ahead and this is going on, and why are those people that have made careers, their academic careers, studying theoretical settler colonial contexts, are not speaking about what is happening in Palestine in your perspective? Where are they now? I was always wondering, where are those people? Where are they all? Like, I would love to hear from you what your ideas. I mean, also feel free to tell me that we're all here with you. I might be just pessimistic these days. Sorry, but I'm watching my family literally shrinking day by day. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about what went wrong, that we have to face this right now and live through these horrific days for 6 months with no one able to stop them. And while we're being silenced and demonized. And
that's a crucial question, essential. Thank you so much for starting actually with this question. And I would open the floor to everyone in the room, friends, comrades, colleagues, whoever likes to think with that question.
I'm happy to. Can you hear me okay if I speak from this vantage point? Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the Duke perspective, my experience with colleagues here. I've only been here for 3 years, and I come from the perspective of Asian American studies and that field's solidarity with Palestine. And I think that your question is such an important one because something that I've been able to see is, I mean, I think that there's certainly a level of delusion. I think that there's a lot of, I feel gaslit oftentimes when you have colleagues who study reproductive justice, colleagues who study, I mean, any kind of thing. I'm in a feminist studies department, so any feminist, and I think that the silence is so loud. And I'm
Definitely in feminist studies as well, the silence is so loud. I agree.
And I think something that I'm trying to think through is, you know, I think that there's ways where people are concerned with self-preservation, their careers. They want to make sure that their careers are set. They don't want to get fired. And so I think that there's a lot of fear, and which, you know, certainly is, I can understand the reasons why, and I can respect the emotion of fear in a way that doesn't even lend towards what does it mean to compare fears. But it's just, it's troubling when you have, I think, these terms, so to be anti-racist, to be, you know, in a coalition, to be a feminist, right? To kind of brand yourself as a leftist or a liberal, or, you know, you're on the right side of history. Wonderful ways to describe oneself. It doesn't measure up to action. And I think that there's various ways that one cannot measure up to the action. But there's simple things I think that one can do. And I haven't, in my perspective, in the various fields that I've been in, I think that there's a lot of ways where, I think both of your comments, I think you were mentioning, what does it mean to be drenched in imperial conceit? And then, you know, we are stuck in time. How much, or what, in what world is this acceptable? So like I gave a paper that's trying to think through kind of afterlives of empire in the world in which we're living. And I don't even know if it's that useful to label the world, but certainly it's an imperial one, it's a fascist one, and for me, I think a lot about complicity. In so many ways, I think feminism has played out is deeply imperial. People love empires. People want them. They want to be at the helm of them. They love power. And I think even in the ways that people orient to each other, there's something about, I think neoliberal multiculturalism in an American context has made it such that there are ways that people love to brand themselves, for instance, anti-racist, and how that is supposed to kind of like, you're a good person because you're anti-racist. So then, you know, it becomes like, yes, we're people of color, we're anti-racist. I'm in a, I don't want to, I can get into some drama, but I won't. But I've been so disappointed in the amount of people that just don't respond to my emails. They don't respond to my texts. I will say, come to the Scholasticide event that people are organizing. Nothing. No one will respond to that. And a group of people who, you know, purport to be feminists and people who are on the left and all these things. Weeks will pass, and then they will go into the group chat and talk about when are we going to gather for happy hour. It's not even acknowledging that. So I don't respond, and they say, what about April 17? I say, that's the National Day of Action. I submit the little link, and then just no one says anything. I'm free April 17th. So I think that kind of very mundane, completely low stakes thing, it's like, how are you not, you know, hurting?
Yeah. I think, I mean, like you experienced it with rage because you're like, imagine how a Palestinian experiences that. Like it's micro violence, all of this, like every day. Imagine my parents have survived the genocide. They are still unable to leave Gaza. Like mentally, they are there. You know what I mean? And then when they have to leave here and look at people doing like normal things, and how do we live like in those parallel realities, and we're like just on the other side of the Mediterranean, and it's completely safe here and fine, and just on the other side our people, they're surviving under tons and tons of explosives falling every day, and food starvations, and like we are being killed in every possible way. And when you see like there are people even 6 months on and they have no idea that there's a genocide going on, how we are being killed in our tens of thousands indiscriminately, like how could people detach themselves from the reality of others in that way? How? And it feels like we're learning nothing from history, from our from other liberation struggles, from other apartheid contexts, from other settler colonial contexts. Nothing is being learned. Like, why don't we learn that it's time for us to be actually braver than ever and face those forces, those barbaric forces heads on with no fear? There is no time for fear, you know, from our perspective. There's no time for fear. And I had understood this. I was victimized. If for those who don't know, I was also victimized at Sheffield Hallam University and was like suspended from work without any prior notice because of an external complaint. So the university like did completely unprecedented actions and very, very, very disrespectful, dehumanizing, racist, all of it. And no academic probably in the history of Sheffield Hallam University that has been subjugated to the treatment I received. And that's because of how entrenched colonial culture is still in academia, that they would sympathize with people who are scared of a potential genocide. This is you know, the main mobilizing line behind Israel and Israelis, that Israel is the heaven basically that would guarantee a never again, right?
May I say
so
something?
they would. Sorry?
I just wanted to first, with all my heart, say that we share many of the points you are saying. I'm Miguel Rojas. I work in Latin American studies, and I have been involved in decolonial thinking and doing for decades already. And why are we in this position is because, as you just said, we are all surviving, surviving systems of power and control, coloniality, we'll say, from the colonial perspective, the colonial matrix of power that has established this way of production of society, and we are just part of it. And from the academia, we have been trying to understand that matrix. And I think that's one of the things that we have been trying to do from within, from historical perspectives, but also in solidarity with peoples that are still surviving today. Yesterday, as an example, in this same room, we had an indigenous woman who is now a filmmaker, and people in the audience ask something about a film she shared, and they say, "Oh, but you are Colombian women subjected to all sorts of violence for so long. Why are you not talking about violence?" And she said, in a very eloquent manner, that she, as a member of an indigenous community, had decided to defend the Mother Earth, Pachamama, that we will survive, that after 500 years of devastation and obliteration and lab grabbing and plagues and all what coloniality has thrown on them, the few of them, right, 10% of a population of an entire continent that survive this clash, are now defending something that is larger than humans, that is those forces that give us life, the forces of life. And
I love
it was very eloquent, but I just wanted to share that, and I share your pain.
we need to, you know what, like there's a beautiful person in our history of struggle. Of course, you know her, Layla Khalid. She's such an iconic symbol of resistance for many girls, many Palestinian girls grew up learning about her, and her example has taught us a lot about what life is worth. And you remind me of something that she said, that she learned through the struggle, that she can be a mother, she can be a wife, she can be loved, and she can love and be loved, and that the struggle wouldn't mean much without fighting for life and all aspects of life. When she says that, she means all aspects of life. Yeah, we're not talking about just humans. We're talking about this eco-balance that will guarantee our collective survival as species, a live species, no matter what kind we are. So this is what actually drove her resistance, the Layla Khalid, and yet she's demonized and made painted as a terrorist, when that was really what drove everything, every action that she's done all her life.
Zina, please.
Hi, can you hear me okay from here? Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I guess I should mention I'm also Palestinian. My grandparents were forced out in 48, so we have not been subject to the violence since then. But thank you. And your question earlier about the dislocation of academics who are supposedly working on these questions from speaking about Palestine or from having some sort of an impact on the political reality, the political discussions, and the violent reality. What made me think about something in your talk, Professor, where you were questioning the lack of coordination between knowledge production and these colonial and imperial figures of knowledge production on Afghanistan. And it reminded me, of course, of, in a slightly different way, of going back to Edward Said and Orientalism as this system of citation that was, this knowledge form was being produced without any real conversation with the Arabs, with the Palestinians, and it sort of being this parallel world. And now we're seeing, especially in the Western media, we're seeing like these conversations about, like you said, a ceasefire for 2 weeks, as if there's some sort of there's like this huge disconnect between what's happening in Israeli conversations and the violence that's happening in Gaza, and we're having these conversations in the West as if these things will make some sort of a difference when we know that they will just return to bombing. And there's this like there are these parallel worlds of knowledge circulation that are not speaking to each other. And so I guess that was just, it was something I was thinking about in your talk about the different forms that these parallel worlds kind of take. And I don't know if that resonates with anything with you, but it was a question that I had.
Thank you.
Is this question to me?
I guess just for everyone, just something I'm thinking about.
Hisayep, do you want to share some thoughts on it?
You know, first I just want to thank you for the strength to share your thoughts and time with us. I'm grateful, and I just have to
Thank you.
say how your presence, although it's virtual, feels really kind of intimate. And I just feel as if the kind of stories or histories that you were presenting are personified here. You perhaps missed the talk, but you're really helping me see just the lived experience of violence in ways that I've not appreciated. And when it comes to the larger, very important question about the silence or complicity in the academy, you know, I think words and how there's just particular words that are obviously particularly important, but it's that I think the consistency of the Israeli information dissemination regime, where I've learned about this phenomena called hasbara, where I don't know enough about it, but it's kind of a training manual for college students about how to discuss Israel.
It's basically the digital army of Israel. You could think about it as the digital army of Israel. and they're literally like billions of dollars go into investing in, and they work under the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, right? And it has like one of the biggest budgets of Israel's ministries. And that's my niece. Chance for Palestine. Do you want to tell them something? Okay, because I'm on a lecture. Yeah. Oh, what I was talking about? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, thank you for.
I was starting to say something though.
Please.
Oh God. Yes. So the biggest, we were talking about hospital, yeah. And the, how like one of the biggest, هذا إلي كان. How like some of the biggest budgets for the state go to the strategic affairs ministry, yeah, and Hasbara was there, and it is basically dedicated to turning myths into facts, and they would have been responsible for the mass rape hoax that was supposed to justify the genocide and the annihilation of Gaza. So many lies that were fabricated from their projections, really, when you think about it, like incredible, all these lies that they've made up. And I saw as just a projection of how, of the sick settler colonial culture, really, that is deeply embedded within the majority of the Israeli society. And at the minute, I believe that we should be braver than ever exposing these things, because the genocide didn't happen by accident. Israel was trying to displace people's attention through Hasbara, through lots of other propaganda. I studied film, right? I analyzed film for my PhD, and I looked at how also documentary film was part and parcel of the legitimation of Israel since before its foundation. So and one of the biggest agents of settler colonialism in Palestine since the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish National Fund has used documentary in order to shift attention from the impact of Zionism on the native Palestinians and represented in a light that is attractive to Western European culture. And they spoke in imperialistic terms and colonial terms when colonialism was still like looked at as a popular, and you know, it wouldn't have anything more than a benign impact on the colonized, but otherwise from the colonial perspective, otherwise colonialism was good for us. Apparently it was just a civilizing mission. And we've seen the civilization, how Israel's and British and US civilizing mission turned out in Palestine. It has only inflicted bloodbath that will take a lifetime, many lifetimes to dry, and disrespected the land, trying to make little Switzerland on an oasis of the Mediterranean with dry and hot weather, imposing on the land trees that didn't go in harmony with the land, and at the same time representing Palestinians to be backward and have nothing to do with civilization. Basically, it's the Zionists that brought the modernity to the land, and they brought the pine trees that frequently go on fire because they imposed it on the land. I'm trying to put my laptop a bit higher so my friends see me, but I need you to give me some silence, Habibti.
Our break, and I'm really sorry I took away your lunchtime already. But I mean, if it is okay with maybe Hanifi Saib, you can.
My only point in mentioning hospital, and thank you for elaborating, but it's just one of many information management techniques.
Yeah.
It's my university kind of became famous because of Holocaust Remembrance Day that became conflicted, and it made national press in Israel because of. But where did the Holocaust Day come from? It's the International Holocaust Committee, or whatever it's called, and that I think it's 0.9 there that equates criticism of.
IHRA definition was born from the same organization, right?
Yeah, it's just the coordination of the information systems is striking in comparison to the disaggregated Palestinian information system, which is just a product of its history in diasporic kind of conditions. And it's just really striking. In the same way, again, so many implicit parallels between the catastrophe in Palestine and what has happened to Afghanistan, which is my concern, which is not a 75-year or 100-year, about half that, but profoundly.
But still, like.
Profoundly.
Yeah.
On a personal, intimate.
Yes.
Can I ask something, or is it okay? I know we're like, but we can do a 20-minute break. I think we're still in the time frame, and if that's okay. I was thinking. So I mentioned this in my two things. I mentioned one thing in my introduction, which is what I find really terrifying, is the ways in which Afghan and Iranian women have become basically showcases to humanize war and occupation, right? In much of public life, which becomes much more salient also now in digital spaces, right? Or because of digitalization, it's more visible the ways in which Afghan and Iranian women are now often isolated from the Palestinian struggle and cater towards US and NATO empire and the whole developmental humanitarian apparatus, right? And there's a lot of whitewashing there that really, really I find worrying. I mean, and the Iranian diaspora in particular is a deeply racist and basically like serving US and NATO empires in many like ways that speak towards the Zionist project that I find terrifying. And then what I find also terrifying among my Afghan friends, interlocutors, is that when the question of Palestine comes up and the ongoing genocide, for many Hazara colleagues and interlocutors, the first reaction was actually, but Hamas has been supporting the Taliban, and they have welcomed the Taliban in 2021. I think it's really interesting, the connections that are built and created in these public encounters, right? And in the ways in which racialized Afghans and Iranians relate to this ongoing struggle in Palestine, right? And I just wanted to share this as like, just to also talk about how do we talk within global South-South conversations about what these tensions that Anna Storti also drew on, and that are often deeply uncomfortable, and maybe we cannot solve them, but how do we even talk about them, right? How do we talk about why it is problematic when neoliberal universities are using exiled Afghans and Iranians in order to then use indigenous feminism to talk about the plight of Afghans and Iranians in Afghanistan and Iran? I mean, to me, this sounds just like a project that comes directly out of the CIA Red Cell, whose works was like published by WikiLeaks and amongst others in a document from 2010, where the CIA Red Cell explains that humanizing the war and occupation is like a tool of counterinsurgency, right? And so how do you render these sites of tension visible for wider audiences, and as well as we try to grapple with these perversions in our own, in the academic spaces that we inhabit? And then I thought it was really important and interesting that Anna was talking about, actually you ended your presentation on the question of what is it we're dealing with? Is it neoliberal fascism? Is it fascism? How do we, like, what kind of analytics do we use to describe it? And I think, Shahid, your important discussion about the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and basically turning Palestine into what Tawfiq Haddad has described as Palestine Limited, right? A site of actually, like, basically, sorry?
It reduced Palestine. It has reduced Palestine to Gaza and West Bank and Jerusalem. And yeah, Palestine Limited. Yeah.
And also like restructuring Palestine by basically what then also happened in Afghanistan, what Michael Parenti described as you give them a currency, you give them a flag, you give them an Independence Day, and the impression that everyone is like independent, but actually, you know, there's no need anymore for this image of puppets in the theater and threats. The threats are not existent anymore. There is a script and it's internalized, which is like, I also think this is the way in which your three contributions really beautifully spoke to each other, the ways in which empire has tangible implications for subject formation. And that, what does that mean for the ways in which, how does this interface with the perpetuation of racial capitalism and the continuation of the imperial worlds that we inhabit, if that makes sense. So maybe like just to go into the break with these questions that we hopefully can come back to. Thank you to your fantastic.
I'm really sorry about this, Panis.
Yes, ma'am.
I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
Absolutely correctly.
But I have to go because iftar is coming soon.
I know. Yeah, you go. Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. So we sent you lots of.
I do have one thought or two about what you've just said. Actually, this is something that disturbs me so much, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about, how, I mean, like when you read Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi and the psychology of the oppressor and the oppressed and the psychology of the colonized and the colonizer, and how oppression manifests in different forms, and all the divide and rule policy of imperialism, and how that can be mobilized for colonial gains. We are under basically a lot of forces, and we need to be very, very conscious with how we're being manipulated and played with, and reject all those ideologies that are trying to displace our feelings and our thinking, and the politics of deflection. Basically, we need to resist those politics of deflection as oppressed people and come united. I think, acknowledging what we have in common, and acknowledging what those in power, those barbarian powers want, and how they are trying to divide us in order to reach their wants. So, I mean, I know that this has played differently in so many different contexts. In Palestine, for example, the Druze, the Palestinian Druze that speak out in our tongue, the same culture, literally same culture, Palestinians, and they were always put at the forefront of confrontations with their own people by the Israeli state. So those, how colonial powers also uses divide and rule within the one community, with the Christians. They also tried in Lebanon, they tried to make believe that Christian Lebanese were different, were not like them, were more like us. Basically, Orientalism played in different ways, and emphasizing certain identities at the expense of others, de-emphasizing others in order to entrench the divides within the colonized people, and help maintain the colonial or post-colonial conditions. Definitely, it's all so disturbing. How you wonder how could people like Afghanis actually buy propaganda created by the US or Israel, and use that to justify and legitimate a genocide. How could we have such a historical amnesia that we forget that Hamas is only born in 1987 and Israel has existed in 1948? Hamas has only existed as a reaction, just like the PLO existed as a reaction. And before Hamas, there was always other terrorists, and after Hamas, there will be, the terrorists will be just interchanged. This is what we need to come to, all of us need to understand this. And I guess once we have this consciousness, this collective consciousness, and how those powers are trying to exploit us and manipulate us, and then we fight with togetherness and love and compassion, hopefully we can win, because those systems were made by human minds, and we can hopefully undo them by a counter ideology that is based on love and compassion. Thank you so much. And I just hope that you continue to do whatever in your power to help us reach to a day where we can actually breathe and live together in dignity and peace. And hopefully one day I will welcome you all at my home in Gaza, which we will rebuild despite them. Enjoy the rest of your show, and I'm really sorry to have to go, but I sorry, and I love you.
Thank you so much for your time. Have a good evening.
So my talk is called Necrogeorgics, 3 Meditations on Death and Dirt, and I'll explain the term directly, shortly. And please, I realize I've never said your last name. So is it Natanzi? Am I saying that correctly?
Musavi Natanzi.
Musavi Natanzi?
Your last name.
Kandi, yeah.
Kandi.
Yeah, very anglicized. So Kunda in German, but yeah, we say Kandi. Okay, so because I address you in my opening paragraph here. So in this response to the provocation of Dr. Musavina Natanzi's roundtable précis, I decided to honor the incisiveness of the questions she formulated by structuring my remarks around 3 of them. Each brief section will involve an exploratory fragment whose ramifications and interrelations I hope will be apparent, if not yet fully articulated, and which I look forward to unpacking during the discussion. As a scholar situated at the intersection of Black studies and the environmental humanities, I am proceeding from the premise that war, anti-Black racism, and climate change are intimately interconnected aspects of a fascistic global settler capitalism. I hope to suggest the relevance to this discussion of the term necrogeorgic, one fundamental to my work on abolitionist ecopoetics. So the first question is, how is knowledge about life and geographies of war accessed? And so I'm going to be talking about a New York Times documentary called The Lost Graves of Louisiana's Enslaved People, which was published on June 27th, 2021. And I think I have a slide here for that. Okay, oh, it's very fancy with its fading. Here we go. How is it? Okay, there's the question that Denise proposed, and this is my meditative answer. Okay, there we go. Okay, along the banks of the Mississippi River, from Point Dumas to Brilliant Point, where the river makes 2 sharp bends, narrow parcels stretch back like shards of glass. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these were sugarcane plantations. Today, petrochemical and plastics plants predominate, although fields, trailer parks, and small towns speckle the landscape. Okay, from time to time, a lone tree or a small copse of trees interrupts the gridded topography. There's one of them. The fade is very dramatic. Okay, there we go. Researchers call such interruptions anomalies, unusual topographic features. Superimposing maps of this area going back 150 years on top of one another, a firm in London called Forensic Architecture, working in conjunction with local archaeologist Don Hunter, has demonstrated that these anomalies and many other sites are likely the graves of enslaved people who were forced to labor on sugarcane plantations. And I think there's one more picture here. Okay, I'm going to skip over the clips right now, but I can share this, the link to the video so you guys can watch how the maps are superimposed on top of each other, and they can see the markings of the burial sites with crosses or just little hashtags that sort of show a little mound or something like that, and they trace how they map onto current cartographies, I guess, of the area. So using aerial photography taken by the US government in 1940, they have in fact identified more than 1,000 such topographical anomalies. The only way to confirm the existence of such a burial ground is through an archaeological dig, an expensive and potentially troublesome process for a landowner eager to exploit these parcels' easy access to the river. Present visual imagery suggests that of the 1,000 that were visible in 1940, only 329 such sites remained in 2021. The local activists working to identify, locate, confirm, preserve, and provide access to these burial grounds have met with limited success. After contacting Texaco, Star, Enterprise, Motiva, and Shell, only Shell ever responded with any interest in preserving potential burial grounds beneath their manufactories. While Shell preserved 2 sites with an estimated 1,400 graves between them and theoretically made them accessible to descendants, such access is granted by appointment only. And who knows how long it's actually going to last. In the Times documentary, local activist Sharon Levine orients the reporters to the social ecology of the area, which has long environed untrammeled violence against Black bodies. Now the landscape is, this is Sharon Levine, now the landscape is Black community, chemical plants, sugarcane fields, Black community, chemical plant. How can we define this area, St. James Parish, as anything other than a landscape of war that moves on timelines of both fast and slow violence? How does the concentration of death and erasure of its history and patterns of transmission multiply war's violence rhizomatically? How does the work of the archaeologist, the investigative reporter, and the community activist in preserving and making visible records of violence interrupt its networked trajectories? So that's meditation number 1. All these items are in a paper that I'm working on right now, or items are close to items related to these items. So in the longer version of the paper, the connections between them are more spelled out, but it'll be interesting to see how they emerge in this kind of more truncated form. So second question then of Benitez is what constitutes wars? And so my answer to that is the term, which is going to show up any second, necrogeorgic. Okay. In 2011, Joelle McSweeney coined the term necropastoral, which she uses to designate, quote, the manifestation of the infectiousness, anxiety, and contagion occultly present in the hygienic borders of the classical pastoral. Pastoral is a mode, set of topoi or genre of mostly poetry about nature that traces back to classical antiquity. While pastoral has been appropriated and reappropriated to claim specific historical and cultural lineages throughout the ensuing centuries, scholars locate the origins of this kind of writing in Virgil's eclogues, where a shepherd whose situation in a locus amenus, or a beautiful place, causes an internal poetic event that elicits song. McSweeney's intervention into the works gathered by this term shines a metaphorical blacklight that reveals in these works messiness, decay, achronicity, anachronicity, entanglement, horrifying putrescent mixings that, in her words, eat away at the model of literary lineage that depends on separation, hierarchy, before and after, on linearity itself. For McSweeney, necropastoral sets loose a rat body in the edifices of hegemony. So you can see why I'm fascinated by her in this term. From McSweeney's generous and generative vision of necropastoral, I am coining the term necrogeorgic. While a leisured relationship to non-human nature conditions the pastoral mise-en-scène, labor mediates human contact with the non-human in the, labor mediates human contact with the non-human world in the Georgic. The original Georgics, also Virgil's, contains 4 books of agricultural precepts. The Georgics are premised on the unrelenting toil of earning bread by the sweat of one's brow, and uses agricultural labor to metaphorize the labor of writing poetry, as Virgil was for his patron, the Emperor Augustus. Like the pastoral, Georgic writing has gone in and out of vogue in the Anglophone world, enjoying a moment of popularity during the 16th century, which in a longer version of these remarks, I would index as a means of the culture processing the ramifications of colonization and forced labor in the New World. So there's this outburst of, or this renaissance of Georgics in that time, which are often focused on English estates, right? So there are these estate poems, but there's a lot of interesting scholarship that suggests they're also about bonded labor in the New World. So the necrogeorgic is an analytical term, allows me to re-see poetic works that thematize agricultural labor, both allowing them to be understood as nature writing and allowing them to speak of the troubled, violent, disruptive relationship with non-human nature that the structures of colonial capitalism have produced. Necrogeorgic as an analytic lens and an interpretive term centers the racialized and colonial violence that conditions agricultural labor under capitalism, allowing it to come into terrifying and grievous focus. Necrogeorgic stages strange encounters of its own by putting human flesh and soil into intimate contact, even while resacralizing that proximity and affinity as the stance of a warrior, resisting the linked deanimation of flesh and earth violently imposed by the property form. Necrogeorgic suggests that the social conditions of labor and consumption are themselves nothing short of outright war, a slow burning war that forms the background of flashes of violence that use related technologies, explosives, incendiaries, the hammering of plowshares and fertilizer into Teflon-coated bullets and bombs. In necrogeorgic poetry, the death and violence of the forced labor camp emerges in and as an attempt to make possible restorative relationships with land in and as poetry. So it's acknowledging and holding on to the specificities of those histories, but also working to sort of open up something new and to transform it into something that's often sort of botanical in its energy. So the necrogeorgic helps broaden the critical horizon around what can count as nature writing, and crucially, I think, include, again, these accounts of violence in that category, and what non-white, non-canonical nature writing might make vitally, crucially possible at a time of planetary crisis. So that's an overview of necrogeorgic. And so now I'm going to read, well, here, hold on. I guess I should read the next question of Panice's, how do wars relate to settler colonialism? And so to answer this one, or to think about it, I'm going to give you a short meditation on a poem called Ars Poetica with Bacon, which is by Terence Hayes. And I'm a little bit on the fence about this one, whether I think it's actually a necrogeorgic, but it's close to necrogeorgic. So I might kind of go back and forth in these couple of paragraphs. And you're like, well, what does she think? Is it or isn't it? And the answer is, I don't totally know. So maybe, again, that discussion might help me clarify that a little bit. Okay, Terence Hayes, Ars Poetica with Bacon. I'm going to kind of give you a quick rundown of the poem, and then I'll look at a portion of it in slightly greater detail and let you read a portion of it too. Terence Hayes, Ars Poetica with Bacon, situates a state of war within the context of settler colonialism. So again, it spoke to me as relevant to this particular question that Panice posed, while sounding aspects of necrogeorgic writing. So I think it's being necrogeorgic in its intersection of those two concerns. In the poem, a family displaced from their home by war encounters a stray, and Hayes actually compares it to an orphan, a stray pig, rooting in the bushes for what the poem's eye speculates might be an egg. And I use the word eye hesitantly or deliberately, because of course there's been a lot of interrogation of the limitations of the lyric eye as something that imposes a universality that's implicitly white, right? The eye is sort of a version of, the lyric eye in poetry is a sort of a version of what Sylvia Wynter calls man, right? The category man with a capital M. So quote unquote eye. Rooting in the bushes for what the poem's eye speculates might be an egg. The poem lingers in the conditions of violation, hunger, and embodiment that ultimately lead them to eat the pig, an act, the poem suggests, that signifies that they are predators too, if in a different vein and at a different scale than that at which the warmongers who've displaced them operate. And there's the picture of the book that the poem's taken from. The poem lingers in a sense of obscurity and occludedness. It's almost like the speaker can't quite see everything around him or her or it, questioning its own impulse to find meaning by stabilizing entities into the lines of narratives. And here's a short quote. Like the pig, I too wanted to reach through the thorns for the egg or ball, believing it was a symbol of things to come. I wanted to roll it in my palm like the head of a small red bird until it sang to me. In other words, every entity might sing its own song, tell a story of violation and hunger that has the quality of song. The poem connects war to settler colonialism, I contend, in its invocation of agricultural labor as the backdrop of the family's flight. The poem's eye considers its role as a Virgilian guide in this murky, partially obscured underworld. And here's the, so if I can see it, the poem, and this is the little bit, this is the end of the poem. Yeah, I'd been hired to lead the family from danger to a territory full of more seeds than bullets. But truth was, in the darkness, there was no telling what was rooting in the soil. Plots of complete silences, romantics posing in a field legend by shame. The heart, biologically speaking, is ugly as it pumps its passion and fear down the veins, which is to say, starting out, we have no wounds to speak of beyond the ways our parents expressed their love. We were never sure what the pig was after or whether it was in fact not a pig, but some single-minded soul hunger turned into a pig, some devil worthy of mercy. Without giving away the enigmatic ending, I will say, when we swallowed the flesh, our eyes were closed. So there's the poem. And it's quite dense and interesting, as you can see. So I'll riff on it a little bit here. The poet's interest in the possibility of using non-human nature, specifically soil, with the images of the bullets and the seeds, along with botanical agency to transform trauma into something that can simultaneously hold space for knowledge of the trauma, while also providing nourishment, beauty, and new life, makes me want to claim this poem as a necrogeorgic, because I think that's one of the qualities, is that transformation, not fully transformation, but the holding of violence inside the creation of something new and potentially beautiful and nourishing. And in its parallel of bullets and seeds, I believe it is naming settler agriculture as a form of war, while holding open the possibility that another kind of husbandry might generate new possibilities that might not merely create another cycle of violence. However, unlike the poems I've begun to gather under the term necrogeorgic, Ars Poetica with Bacon displays a certain resignation that belies the manic, regenerative, and faintly retributive zombie energy I've begun to associate with the term. The pig might be some devil worthy of mercy. The family swallows the flesh of the pig. And that's kind of where I'm going to stop my meditation, so I'll just raise a few questions for discussion. What nuance lies in the closed eyes of the family who swallows the flesh? While the closed eyes certainly recall the obscurity, occludedness, and heteronomy the eye tries to conjure, they also signal a kind of reverence for the flesh that they practice as they eat, a small but saving distinction, and to my mind, one that emblematizes the work of the spiritual warrior against the global forces making war on animate flesh, on animate land and animate flesh. And actually, that's the ending. I thought I was going to raise questions, but I came to a little conclusion instead. I changed it yesterday, so thank you so much. Yeah.
Whoa, how lovely floor it is. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. Such fascinating, varied papers, approaches. Since I come from a social science department, mine is going to be really boring. And will not entirely speak to the criteria you set out, but
It does.
thank you. My title is Peace, War, and Missing Data. And I start with the image of a political scientist, American, named J. David Singer. I don't imagine anybody in this room has heard of J. David Singer, but he's a major figure in American political science because he's the founder of one of the preeminent cross-national historical time series data sets used in the social sciences, known as the correlates of war. In 1963, he was a peace activist. He testified on behalf of nuclear disarmament, arms reductions treaties. He would be soon active in the anti-peace movement against the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam. Published on conflict resolution, established the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution at the University of Michigan, where he spent almost his entire career. In 1963, he launches this project to try to understand under what conditions have wars emerged and under what conditions are wars avoided. And to do this, he realizes, he needs to start with a list of wars. And so he spends several years with a bunch of research assistants, postdocs, colleagues, and grant funding from the University of Michigan, various private foundations, and later various government agencies to go through history books and create a list of all the wars that have occurred since 1816. And they realize as they're doing this, they have to make some decisions. What counts as war? So they decide, for example, that they're not really going to include civil wars. They're mostly interested in interstate wars. And they make a decision that minor wars are too numerous and difficult to study, so they're only going to count wars that have 1,000 or more battle-related deaths. And they make some other decisions. The other decisions include the criterion that at least one party in this war must be a member of the interstate system. The interstate system is a term that had been used in political science, was countries that recognize one another as countries. Because he was most interested in when did governments decide to go to war with one another, and less interested in other forms of collective violence that he felt were going to be too difficult to study in this initial phase. He had grand hopes for this project. He really thought that this was, that knowing the causes of war in this grand statistical manner would help to avoid wars, that we could then change these conditions or manipulate conditions so that we would not have these barbarous forms of conflict around the world. Very committed then both to this idea of peace, one of the founders of what's called now the Peace Studies Association, and also to the principles of high modernism, where data was going to help to save the world from itself. This is not common, not specific just to him. This was a period of the formation of data sets, many of which had these kind of lofty ideals and values behind them. The data was going to help humanity. The challenge then was that a bunch of wars, he had to decide what's a state. And so a bunch of wars are between entities that might or might not have been states. So they come up with a coding rule that sounds almost comic in retrospect. They said you were a state if you had a permanent diplomatic mission at the charge d'affaires level or higher from France and Britain. That was their criteria. Okay. After World War I, it was like if you could also get into their categories, but into the data set by having membership in the League of Nations or in the United Nations. But prior to that, it was France and Britain. So you can imagine if France and Britain didn't recognize some entity and yet they're party to a war, they don't count. The second criterion was that this 1,000 battle-related deaths only counted from the side of the war that was in the interstate system. And they're explicit about this. The phrase they use here is, here, let me read a quotation. On the deaths on the non-systemic side, that is, these other entities, such as colonial wars and so on, where imperial wars, where an imperializing nation is conquering some other entity that they have not granted diplomatic recognition to. Says that, of course, there are deaths on both sides. And there's death on the what they call non-systemic side. Quote, While such deaths did not go unmourned, they often went uncounted or unrecorded, and that the evidence of the levels of casualties are of dubious authenticity, and therefore they didn't count. So there's a series of wars that don't count because they didn't rise to 1,000 battle-related deaths on the European side or the American side, but we know from historical accounts many thousands of deaths on the non-systemic side. This was finally corrected, revised, this criterion, in 2010, version 4 of the data set. So after more than 40 years of data collection, they decided to revise it. So this is clearly a data set that reflects the exclusionary practices of European diplomacy, even though his whole idea of being systematic in creating a data set was to avoid what he called previous ethnocentric approaches. Turns out the scope of the project would not be global as they advertised initially, and as the book itself that comes out has this map of the world locating all 93 wars that fit their criteria. It looks like it's all wars in the world since 1816, but in fact, if you get into the weeds, it's not nearly all the wars in the world. So wars that did not count included for the first two versions of the data set, the British Anglo-Afghan wars. The first two did not count, although they were added in the third version. The wars between Santo Domingo, present-day Dominican Republic, and Haiti in the 1850s, the Dominican War of Independence, was excluded because European powers had not recognized Haiti. They had refused to recognize Haiti for decades, and therefore Haiti does not enter the interstate system until several years after that. China's wars, imperial wars of expansion against the kingdoms of Central Asia, are noted in the data set and then excluded because China did not have permanent diplomatic representation by France and England. The Hijaz and the Najd and its conquest of the Hijaz in the 1920s are excluded because neither Najd nor the Hijaz, which the Najd becomes Saudi Arabia, had diplomatic memberships. Now, it turns out that China had been refusing diplomatic missions from Europe, and it was only through war that they were forced to accept permanent diplomatic missions from European nations. And the Hijaz had also rejected membership. They were invited to sign the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, and refused because the king of the Hijaz considered the treaty to be unfair to Arab interests. So it's not even that the Europeans were excluding them, that they were felt that involvement in this interstate system was not in their own interests. And then there's a number of wars in Africa and elsewhere that don't show up at all because neither party is recognized. Now, in a later version of the data set, there's a new category for these conflicts. That is, they realize they're missing out on wars. And they call them non-state wars. They're still not willing to grant statehood to the Kingdom of Dahomey or other entities. Statehood, in this view, is something that could only be granted by a gesture in London and in Paris. And then they go even further, because the goal of the thing was not just to list the wars, but to see what conditions led to war and what conditions did not. So they create a separate data set that has things like population, urbanization, energy consumption as a proxy for economic development, iron and steel production as a proxy for industrial development, military expenditures and size of the armed forces as proxies for the military strength of a country for each year since 1816. this data set is incredible. As you can imagine, a huge amount of work goes into it. What is strange is that although the code book describes its coverage as all countries in the world, what counts as a country is not all of the world. And in particular, the definition of statehood meant that colonies were not included. So there's just no data. So a country, China, pops into the data set when it is recognized in 1860, when it's recognized. Suddenly 400 million more people live in the world than in 1859, according to their data set. In 1947, 400 million South Asians appear in the data set. In 1960, 100 million Africans appear in the data set. Simply weren't in the data before then. Because they don't have any of these correlates for colonies, much less for pre-colonial entities, like the Kingdom of Dahomey, almost half of their wars they can't predict because they don't have data. They've decided not to have data on those. So they are undermining their own project. One of the central goals to compare the conditions that lead to war and the conditions that don't. Suddenly half of the wars, they simply have no data. They've excluded data on these things. And these countries, as the colonies, are still missing in the most recent version of this data set, which was released version 6 in 2021. Most of the world is missing in other cross-national data sets from that period as well. Arthur Banks, a political scientist at Binghamton, project cross-national time series indicators, it's missing colonies. Ted Robert Gurr, political scientist at Northwestern, creates another data set in the early 70s called the polity data set. It's missing all of those. And hundreds, if not thousands, of scholarly publications resulted from these systematically incomplete data sets, and drew God knows what kind of biases in those results. So what I'm hoping to do is to rerun these classic findings, classic social science analyses, with more complete data, because newer projects have attempted to fill in these huge blanks on the map with these cross-national data sets. That would allow us to see whether these findings that came from these limited data sets still hold if colonies count. If these unrecognized and pre-colonial or non-colonial, non-recognized entities count, like literally get counted, and also count in the sense of importance, whether these major social science findings still hold up. Now, these new data sets themselves have lots of missing data. It's hard to get annual data on every political entity in the world, on every population for every year since 1816. But the missing data in these newer data sets is for lack of sources where interpolation or other estimation processes need to be attempted. It's no longer by design. Thank you.
Yeah, with that in mind, turn the lights. Oh, thank you.
That one or?
I think that one will be good. And, thank you so much for sticking around, and let's move a little bit in a space and time differential here, and appreciate the invitation to talk about war, knowledge, ecology, and imperialism. And what I'm attempt to bring you is how long temporalities, geological time, also brings short temporalities in the argument of war, conflict, and peace in Colombia. Colombia, as you know, is located in the southern tip of South America. It's richly endowed with natural resources such as sun, soil, and water. That's the most important tropical belt, but also, of course, minerals, forests, a large biodiversity, right? It's classified like one of the world's most biological diverse countries in the world, ranking second only to Brazil in terms of mega diversity. Colombia is right there. Hosts nearly 10% of the planet's biodiversity, 50% of all the birds, 30% of all mammals, 25% of all reptiles. Then possesses a rich complexity of ecological, climatic, biological, cultural ecosystems. The country has several areas of high biological concentration, like the one that we're going to be talking today, that is Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, indigenous Iku language Wanambindua. But also the Andean ecosystem, the flat savannas of the east, the Amazon rainforest, the humid ecosystems in the Chocó biographical region. The abundance of natural resources has not prevented conflict. Actually, natural resources is a characteristic in many countries with natural resources as a factor of conflict. Colombia's environmental wealth is deeply embedded in Colombia's armed conflict and land disputes, and land is not the only resource at stake. Various natural resources, including minerals, water, timber, illegal crops, fuel the armed conflict in Colombia. The closest armed conflict that we have been dealing with is this half-century conflict between the FARC-EP, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the People's Army, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, Ejército del Pueblo, with the state after a long process of bipartisan power struggles. And here just the map of Colombia, the size of Colombia, the amount of territory that Colombia entails in terms of size, and of course, then you think about their wealth. Then to combat the power of the FARC that was created in 1964, a number of paramilitary forces emerged across the country, creating an irregular war that lasted from the mid-1980s to today, with the result of 250,000 people dead, 7 million internal displaced people in an internal conflict, not interstate conflict. At one point, the country was divided in three countries: the paramilitary nation, a guerrilla nation, and the state-recognized nation. In 2005, a peace agreement was cut with the paramilitaries. In 2016, a peace agreement was signed between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP. The guerrillas stipulated that the armed groups, this agreements stipulated that armed groups will disarm and reintegrate into society. How they will do that? By telling the truth about their crimes. By telling the truth, they will commit to peace, reconciliation, restitution, and the promise of not repetition. And the government will give them full pardon. While these agreements have been monumental in ending decades of long conflict, they did not address the long-lasting colonial legacies and many of the natural resource issues that sustained the conflict in the first place. The agreements failed to include the necessary environmental governance provisions to address the socioeconomic needs of remote territories after the guerrillas and paramilitaries were demobilized. While the agreements contain some general environmental clauses, most related to preserving protected areas and issues of land tenure, they did not specify any environmental governance in territories that were previous to the object of conflict. Most notably, it does not include the vision of how the environment and the natural resources are central to sustaining and strengthening communities affected by the armed conflict and to development and livelihood needs of the people. Thus, one of Colombia's most significant challenges after signing the peace agreements is the institutional vacuum and lack of environmental governance in territories most affected by the armed conflict. In the absence of environmental governance mechanisms, some of these territories have experienced increased rates of deforestation and violence. In this photo, we see how some members of the FARC, historic FARC, decided to return to armed struggle after 2016. And here we have in the right, Jesus Santrich, who is actually of Palestinian Syro-Lebanese descent, that his family came in the early 20th century, and one of the most famous legendary FARC guerrilla members who was murdered in Venezuela 2 years ago. The historic 2000 peace agreement with the FARC was built not only around the official actors, the government and the guerrillas, but also with the participation of victims of diverse origins and many of indigenous peoples. A term was born out of their involvement in the negotiation, territorial peace. Since 2016, this concept has become relevant in including people living in conflict zones and the environment in each or any plan of the process of moving ahead. Legislation has been developed around the term, and some provisions have considered even rights of nature. Colombia's justice system is evolving in the process as the judiciary finds the limits of the courts and starts visiting and opening dialogue with other jurisprudence, the law of origin, the natural laws of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. And hearings are taking, hearings that are trying to mediate disputes, they go in situ, not from the stance of the courts, they go to the territories. This is a paradigmatic change in legislation nowadays. Jump here because of time. Conflict at the center of the world. This is going to be like a case study of the territorial peace. For the indigenous peoples of Guanabindua, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, this place is the center of the world. The place is a massive pyramid of a base of 100 kilometers, 3 sides, and 5,700 meters over the sea level. Two factors make it even more favorable for its bio, geo, and cultural diversity. Its proximity to the Caribbean Sea is the tallest mountain in front of an ocean, and its isolation from the rest of the Andean range system in South America. These elements have been maintained through its geological history. Still, its current biota was formed in the Quaternary period, 2.5 million years ago, creating in the northern flank a very high biodiverse space, humid jungle that continued towards the snow-capped summits through cloud forests, even during the arid phases of the Pleistocene. On the northern flank, there is an altitudinal depression of biotic zones, which means that elements of the temperate terminal floor are located at very low elevations. This place is a laboratory of life. It has all the geobiological ecosystems, 300 ecosystems, and all climates due to its location and the altitude. The Sierra Nevada is an isolated, indigenous metamorphic massif located in the tropical belt with all possible ecosystems determined by its current height from the sea level to 5,700 meters, more than 8,000 feet over the sea level. And it's crested with 2 snow peaks. Buenavindua and Alongue is the apus, sacred apus, male and female, that also represent the breast of the mother, and the milk of the mother is the ice, the snow, the water. The Sierra Nevada is divided into 3 large holes, macro basins that made up a system of more than 30 rivers. The rivers provide water for more than 2 million people in the lower areas, more than 10 billion cubic meters annually. And this place has been the living space of the Tairona. Since 200 AD, Sierra Nevada has been inhabited by the Tairona and their ancestors, a group of societies that built large settlements in the northern and western sides of the Sierra, of a place of larger than 5,000 square kilometers. They used sophisticated systems of terraces, cobblestone paths. They built large towns in each basin, from the Tucurinca River to the Magdalena and Ancho River in La Guajira. Archaeologists have documented about 270 sites By the 15th century, there were about 500 towns of different sizes and levels of architectural complexity, an estimated population of 200,000 indigenous Taironas. There is evidence of extensive and intensive agriculture with an excellent diversity of products such as corn, cassava, beans, squash, cotton, dozens of fruit trees, together with collections of honey hives, river fish, sea fish, hunting that sustain this population. Domestically, they were very active in trade with other communities in the Caribbean, the large Caribbean. They were well known for their sophisticated goldsmithing, cotton blankets, carving of semi-precious stones, etc. They also were recognized in their trade routes with Mesoamerica to Brazil, and many in the archaeological sites, many of these products outside of the region has been identified. Upon the arrival of the European colonizers in the area around 1514, and the establishment of the city of Santa Marta, is the oldest city in the continent of America, was founded in 1525, that is still alive. The Tairona political units were identified. They were trying to be occupied, and they tried to be dominated. The Spaniards didn't understand well the Tairona and unleash their military campaigns to try to dominate them. By 1550, 85 to 90% of the population died, not only due to war, but to plague. And here I'm going to bring some of the stories that the current Taironas or the descendants of Taironas are saying in this process of building peace. After the arrival of the Spanish and the entry of the diseases, the plagues from the old world, and the dissemination of the population, many cycles of conflict have come also to that region. Santa Marta is a complete sociocultural space, but with lots of disarticulation in their populations. Through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the few Tairona that survive moved high into the massive, escaping contact, and created the three nations, indigenous nations that are still alive today: the Kogi, the Arhuaco, the Wiwa, and the Cancuamo. They look just like this. And their population is starting to grow again. During this time, 350 years of isolation, the nation state tried then to convert, organize, and incorporate these people into first the colonial and then the republican system via Catholic missionaries from different orders, right? The Jesuits brought, for example, first coffee to these populations in the early 1700s. 1730 is the year. This is the birthplace of coffee of Colombia, this location and this indigenous. The order, the Jesuit, grew in economic and political power in the colonies and Spain, and as you know, Charles III decided to expel the Jesuit from the European peninsula and from the American continent in 1777. They came back in 1814 later and were expelled again from Colombia in 1850. For this reason, Spanish towns were not founded in the upper parts of the territory because these people didn't like them. There's only one town that was abandoned in 1756. It's called Nausimaque, the current capital of the Arhuaco people. After the Spanish colonization and during the early years of the new republic in the 19th century, the Sierra Nevada suffered also several settlement processes and attempts, including the failed creation of agricultural colonies, the sale of land to European migrants. Nowadays, you actually find blue-eyed people with the last name Schultz in these mountains. But the harsh conditions of the tropics, the general access to markets were impediments for development. Unfortunately, the lower areas gave rise to the banana agri-industry, of course, sugarcane industry in the early 20th century with the arrival of companies like the United Fruit Company, etc., and large coffee plantations took place in the lower parts of the Sierra in famous haciendas like La Victoria, the Cincinnati Coffee, Vista Nieve, and Colonial Seeds that were major brands of coffee in the early 20th century. There are new seeds and territorial peace. Some of the most intense settlements process occurred in the middle of the 20th century. Also, to a new arrival, thousands of families escaping from political violence in the interior of the country came after 1948 and tried to take hold of the Sierra from the 1950s on, expanding initially coffee production, but they found again that the conditions, the geographical conditions, were too harsh. What is interesting is that this place in the 1950s and 60s became the center of marijuana production for international markets, right? In 1980, a Washington Post article said, quote unquote, 6 years after Santa Marta's Gold became the world's most widely smoked marijuana and Colombia, the main US source of pure cocaine, the Colombian connection, it has had profound impact on its country's social, economic, and political life. This is 1980, the Washington Post. That place, Sierra Nevada, is the place of marijuana and then cocaine, two of the seeds that were included in this new neoliberal long global exchange. Marijuana at first was estimated to produce $1.5 to $1.6 billion a year in the 1970s and 1980s. Cocaine became a $40 billion market in the year 1990 and early 2000s, and actually is still today a very active market globally, and Colombia is still the largest producer of cocaine in the world. Then this region has been on the spell of the US war on drugs for more than 40 years. Part of the ways to control the traffic was to spread Agent Orange, glyphosate, to many areas of this territory, creating terrible consequences for the ecosystems. But now, thanks to people like Daniel Gomez, a former coca grower coming from a family of marijuana traffickers, who is the president of the Rural Council of his territory, and now a guide in the Trail of the Sacred Yuna city that we're going to talk about in a second, recall, and I quote, these seeds created another phenomenon, huaqueria. Huaqueria is stop robbing, treasure hunting. The Tairona people had also planted their dead across Sierra Nevada for millennia. This is urns, funeral urns, discovered in Sierra Nevada, how Tairona returned their dead to the land in womb-formed ceramic pots, and planting them across the Sierra, and of course offering all sorts of objects, among them many gold objects. Then that's another seed that came, the pillaging of archaeological treasures. Gomez recalls how, after the forced eradication of the marijuana trade and the consecutive moving into plantations in greenhouses in the US, some settlers left the land, others returned to coffee cultivation, others began illegal planting coca, and at the same time doing lots of treasure hunting during the late 1980s and 1990s. This short period of prosperity was followed by another armed conflict, right? Because these illegal operations created a magnet for guerrilla forces to come and get some of the wealth, and paramilitary forces to protect some of these illegal issues, creating an entire new war in that location. At that point, 170,000 inhabitants were distributed across the Sierra, just matching what the indigenous Tairona were 400 years later, before. And just going to finish with this. During that period, in 1972, this place was discovered, the sacred city of the Yuna. it was discovered by some of these robbers, treasure hunters. And after a war that took place for the possession of the treasure that was found in this place, archaeologists came with the military, they took control, and after a few years, in 1985, a new archaeological park was created, the UNA, or Lost City Park. But today, to get there, you need to ask former paramilitary fighters that are working with former guerrilla fighters, that are working with indigenous campesinos that were forced displaced victims of these fights, and indigenous peoples to get there. Then they are managing a wonderful space in which conflict has passed, trying to create a new path forward in which reconciliation and a way to move forward happens. And with that, they have been able to bring the Call of the Elder Brothers. The Call of the Elder Brothers is the following. This man, his name is Mamo Romualdo, tries to keep balance of the world through offerings, meditation, and rituals, connecting several sites in Sierra Nevada in the highest parts of the massif, close to the milk of the mother, the ice, the water, to access points across the planet. And the message that they are bringing is this, and I quote, Romualdo Secuma, his name, last name, his name in Iku language, and here I am with him last week, quote unquote, protect the water, protect the land, the animals, the air, and the balance of all living things. The question is how? The answer is to draw on indigenous understanding of environmental impacts, the victims of long violence, and ways to engage in indigenous expertise, environmental impact assessments, and action. And he said something else, and I finish with this. Without thought, nothing could exist. They are ascetic philosophers of the mountains. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your really thought-provoking remarks, contributions. What do you think, because of time, we have 55 minutes, if we just connect already, both like conversations, but of course we can start off like with the ways in which now this second round, the second session and the contributions speak to each other, but already maybe make the connections to the previous conversations and remarks that we heard. How does that sound? Yeah? Anna, would you like to? Oh, you have to leave. All right. No, of course. Lovely. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, thoughts, questions.
I love Charlie's critique on the missing data. I think I work on that nexus between political science, environmental science, and the humanities. And we have this always tension about how you can tell what is there, how we can just take account of the phenomena that is happening, right? In climate science, we're trying to measure and model everything, right? To come up with forecasts and ideas about how we face this. Again, it's a very short temporality, 1816, 2014, right? It's just modernity at its worst. but environmental scientists that are trying to temporal looks, right, that go really way beyond. Our conflicts of the 20th century are, again, very short-sighted. We have to look at them in long temporality, short and long, like accordions kind of operations in which this music happens, right, in the accordion. Right? It has to breathe in and out, in and out. And I think it's something that we in the humanities and social sciences are able to do if we jump with other kinds of disciplines that give us, some sort of entry into this missing voices, missing data. We have to collaborate to bring data that is hard and soft. People on the ground and on satellites all together. And I love that kind of thing. Critique from within the discipline.
I was wondering too, Charlie, what did the original data set suggest about what are the causes of wars, and like how have the answers changed, or how, well, I guess you haven't. How do you anticipate that the answers will change? Like, what are the principles that they extracted from all that data in terms of?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is they suggested that wars are more likely when parties are more equally matched in terms of resources, because you're not quite sure which side is going to have the advantage, and so things could trigger where the inequalities are more obvious. They said that people will negotiate, countries will negotiate because they already know the outcome. But if they're not including all of these wars with colonized places in that data, then I suspect that you'll get much more inequality mattering. No rational choice has kind of taken over political science. And so the idea that these are rational decision makers and they're calculating everything out in advance. Right. The rest of us who live in the real world know that's not really the case. And that, so I suspect that models may show that. There's other models, though, about, say, democratization. And not to do with war, but in a broader project, right? There's other major things, and like waves of democratization. And if you include the colonies in the denominator, populations that were not enfranchised, but were part of the country, part of the empire, like within the British and French and so on, statistical yearbooks, they're not going to look so good anymore in global democratization. Demographic transition. So I'm hoping to go through a variety of major social sciences. I mean, one of the challenges, though, is in creating to model the world numerically involves so much loss. As you all know, as humanities people, one of the problems is that the borders change over time. And so to count an entity that has very different borders, so the way they've solved it today, at current state of the art, is to take today's borders and project them backwards in time. And imagine if this country had existed with the current borders in the early 19th century, what would its characteristics have been? So because but then that wasn't the entity that went to war. That could be part of it, or it could be a superset. All of this stuff is impossible, and I'm hoping that lots of people will make their careers in this. I was struck with your thing. First of all, thank you for explaining what Georgians are. Why is it called George? I mean, George, is that a Greek word or something?
You know, I don't know. I actually don't know. Or maybe I knew and I forgot. But yeah, I'm not totally sure what the etymology of it actually is. If it has to do with what the British called it, but I don't think it is. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Is this? I just to the big picture thing. Is this a thing that people who know the history of poetry would know that there is this style?
It's fairly.
I heard of lyrics.
Yeah.
So Georgios is a Greek word that means farmer.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
It is from farmer then. So okay.
Pastoral.
Yeah.
Ironical.
Yeah.
Geo meaning earth and ergon meaning work.
Oh, so earth and work, so it's literally in the term.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, no, they're fairly obscure terms. Like even people who, I think if you were a specialist in poetics, you would probably know Georgic. But even within poetics, like a lot of people know pastoral, but they don't really pay much attention to Georgic. And even like Lawrence Buell in The Environmental Imagination, he kind of collapses Georgic into pastoral and says that basically pastoral is any kind of writing about non-human nature. And so I'm trying to push back on that and bring, and there are other people as well who concentrated on Georgics, but I'm trying to really like bring more, say that it has this kind of interesting, it can bring this sort of interesting focus to these different kinds of works and draw our attention to some of the kinds of things that they're possibly doing or making it possible to imagine.
The distinction has to do with this work?
Yes, yeah, so
The
pastoral is
labor
about.
that goes into the engagement with nature?
Yeah, so pastoral is more like leisure. So the pastoral is like the shepherd playing his flute, who's like sees or sees somebody go by or sees some bird fluttering in the river or whatever, and has this like kind of beautiful aesthetic response to it, or this intense emotional aesthetic response to it that results in singing and like oh, beautiful, beautiful. And then the Georgic is all about actual physical labor on the earth. And there's of course a little bit of dialectical blurring between the two of them, because even Virgil's eclogues are framed within an empiric sort of an imperial setting, and the person who's doing the singing is in conversation with somebody who's just been dispossessed of his land because the emperor has redistributed the land to his soldiers. So the addressee of the eclogues is like, your life is so lucky, you get to sit around here and sing, and I've got, my land got taken away from me by the emperor. And then the singer's singing.
Voice in the poem?
Yeah, it's Maecenas, and because it's like a little conversation. It's like a dialogue between a shepherd and somebody passing by him. And there are 10 of them, 10 eclogues, but he tells different stories, and yeah. So
I have one little bit that may be useless, but that named Marx, and his famous thing about what labor will look like in the ideal world. Totally pastoral. A critic in the morning, a shepherd in the afternoon, and something else that is philosopher. Was it? It was something. Video. None of them involve
labor,
significant labor.
Yeah.
Like, who's going to make the shoes for everybody? Who's going to trash or something. And it's always struck me as a very funny thing, but it seems like the theorist of labor, labor is so central, sort of erases it as sort of a pastoral kind of image, I guess, and not a Georgic image.
Right, yeah. Well, and that's kind of maybe a little bit typical of that time period too, in terms of, because even a lot of, pastoralized representations of the landscape are, there may be a laborer, but it's a romanticized laborer who's not identified with the speaker, right? The speaker is observing the labor, and the labor is sort of part of the landscape in this way that they're not actually feeling the laborer's pain or struggle or anything like that. So, yeah.
So Georgic would have been a more appropriate mode
for Marx, I would have thought, for sure. Is this in Capital or in the Communist Manifesto, or?
No, I think it's in the manuscripts of 1844.
Okay. Sure. I think I might know. Yeah. Okay.
Passage I teach it all the time,
right.
So I should know it better by now.
Okay. Thanks.
I like your first meditation on this land, right, of this almost on patience. When we think about here where we are right now, right, we have all this layering too, right?
Yeah.
Almost savannas, you have mulch, lush pastures for bison and indigenous peoples, and plantation systems, and then tertiary forests now, and then knowledge, right? Layering here, right here where we are. There's extensions of empire, modernity, conflict, war, ecology, that I think very interesting.
Well, I thought your material stuff, especially about the grave urns being excavated and stolen, was super interesting. And again, it's like having, what does it mean to leave them in the earth and to make that land accessible, and how do we preserve it, and how do we preserve the memories and show the proper respect, right? And it's an open question.
Are the urns very large, or have people? They don't wait.
You return to the land. You return to the land. You take the fetal position, and you're planted.
Like a seed.
Then it's a pause. For 1,500 years, the civilization is there. It's an open air archaeological site everywhere you go.
Would they know where they are, or historically would they have known not to till that land, or?
The thing is that the land was covered by the forest for 300 years, certain areas, because it's very tough. And it's very difficult to get here. But now through this settlements and expansion of illegal crops, then lots of forest is taken down, lots of land is reactivated for this, and they have been found with this.
In terms of the market, whether the illegality makes the supply so limited that that's part of the value. That if it were legal, it'd be grown everywhere.
Exactly. Look at marijuana. Marijuana is not a big deal anymore. They don't plant marijuana. Marijuana's not a deal. It's part of the market. It's legal.
Yeah. There's something about like the long delay, then the phase where it's illegal is a relatively brief phase. And then
creates this wealth and
yes,
this complex,
massive wealth.
right? That is connected to coloniality and to imperial, empire, neoliberalism. That is the new phase of empire.
Did you have your hand up?
And I have to leave. I'm sorry.
Well, listen to her. She's gonna.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to. It's not a finished thought, but I was just reflecting on kind of what I mentioned, the connection between
what Sharon presented and what Miguel presented, and like this image at the end of this artist, John Abad, New Drug Cartel, which is very powerful. And also the poem that you shared, the fragment, and I wrote it down like plots of complete silences, romantics posing in a field, bludgeon it with shame. And I was just like, first of all, just, I don't have anything smart to say about this, but I just think about the resonance between that image of that artist and the poem. And then that makes me think of, and then this idea of silence that appears here, which I think kind of ties to this idea of like what counts, no? And I was just teaching a class on silence today with my students. So, and I was talking to them about how there's notions of silence embedded in ideas of preservation and preservation of like nature, no, reservation, and what does it mean to preserve life, no, what counts as life, as existing, as part of like an idea of I don't know, the ecology that has value, no. And I was just thinking of like maybe, and I don't have, again, this is just a running thought, but this, how this idea of silence, no, it's a multifaceted and like term here, but how it can also be a way to engage with some of the questions that are popping up here in the conversations. Yeah, because in some ways, Miguel, when you started and you said that natural resources are also are a factor of conflict in this context, right? So this idea of natural resources itself, it's already shaped by an understanding of what is this environment, right? So it is already shaped by an idea that of a type of listening also. I come from some studies, and so I always think about listening, sorry. In the sense of, like, I had this specific project in my mind today that I was showing my student, which is called 1 Square Inch of Silence. It's like a project of preservation in a national park in the US. And there is this quote about, we need to preserve silence. Silences are like a major resource, no? And I'm like, what does it mean to claim that silence is a resource? And what does it mean to think about this silence as a resource when you don't think about how there's layers of genocide have already silenced so many histories in this land, so that you can actually listen to silence as this place, maybe the complete silences that romantics posing a few bludgeoned with shame, no? I'm just thinking with the poem, and then with that powerful image that appears at the end of your presentation, and how you started by saying, like, natural resources as a factor of conflict, no? So what generates the conflict is already like a kind of like a tamed and ideas and compartments of what that place is itself, like clashing with each other, no? This is just me tripping and making connections. Okay. And
In the case of these people, quote unquote, I will say they have been silenced historically because an issue of coloniality. Coloniality comes with language, text, like words, archives, temporality and music musicality and canons that don't allow others to speak, not even nature. Right? Nature has to be dominated. Nature is chaos. Right? Nature is the other. It has to be controlled. Right? Heidegger, right? The forest is a place without history. It's not that it's silent, it's that we have decided not to hear and not to listen. And suddenly, we need to listen. Or because they say in the way we can understand in our own language what is wrong, or because suddenly we realize, hey, we're losing that is true life. And we have to listen to it. You go to the forest, any forest, deciduous, low alien mist forest, rainbow, is the nose, it's very noisy. Yeah. It's not silence whatsoever, not whatsoever. It's actually very intense, sonic in audio terms, super. But we have to listen, have to tune with it to try to understand that. And I think we are making some progress with that.
Yeah. But also, like, silence is not the absence of sound, right? So,
exactly.
But like, and then in that idea of preservation, again, also, silence is not the absence of sound. The person who was part of that project said, silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the presence of everything, something like that. And I'm like, actually, it's a game of like, what are the limits of what's present? Now that we're negotiating as we engage with what's around us. So it's like not just one idea of silence as the absence, but actually like I don't know, this distribution of, and not just audibilities, no, but modes of recognizing something as existing, no. And again, I'm just trying to weave connections that maybe also point to the question of like what counts. So and all these conversations about war and how they fight about land, fight to land, and in a certain way in which the poetic dimensions also no are, and the sensorial dimensions of how we live are part of it as well. No, I'm just thinking. Yeah, thank you. Just trying to provoke conversations. Don't have anything like solid finished to say. I don't think this works.
It might be picking it up.
La la la.
You can also both like if you like, you know.
La la la.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm done anyway.
No, I was gonna say I could hear it on the thing.
This was very.
I feel important holding it anyway.
Thank you, Maria. No, this was really, really helpful. I think and important. And Charlotte, did you want to?
No, I mean, I'd say my mind goes to the mountain and the river flow. But the mountain people, I know we've lost our expert for that. Yeah, he has to go to another meeting with some mountain people. I think I would have wanted to learn a little bit more about how, is it the Taylor? The people?
Tayrona, yeah.
The Tayrona. How, and again, I know we're dealing with the nation state of Colombia. How, in the context, of course, war is little war, but I'm wondering if there are official, not official ethnography, but I'm wondering how their place and culture is captured by the nation state archives. On the one hand, kind of the history of that people in the context of Colombia, the nation state, outside of the strategic guerrilla or insurgent war. But then sort of more about their sense of their own history, or origin myths, or whatever climactic or earthquake event stands out in their history. What are the markers of their history, and how was their history marked in the Colombian nation state? Is what I would have wanted to know more about. And then the intersections between Colombia and Afghanistan through It's just stand up. Worthy of something to pursue, I imagine. In terms of, and I don't know, he had talked about marijuana and cocaine, and I don't really know what opium, where it stands, particularly with the agriculture, you know, the production of opium, the production of marijuana. Downtown still both, right? Just a little more comparative, sort of, the war on drugs kind of thing, because the EPA had a larger presence in Afghanistan than the CIA, rather, in the 80s and 90s. I myself, in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a liberal haven of smoking, and I saw myself a block of hash with the mafia standpoint.
Ah, where did you find it?
In Madison.
It's very hard to
on the
find.
sidewalk? No, it was in an apartment. Yeah, no, I think that would be worth something.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, it has to be said that.
I mean, just because of the signature, the stamp. Or so I hear. The point is that in Madison, there was, clearly a network that brought hash there. But there was also a sort of the touring of the Mujahideen leaders to the local mosques around the university. So on the one hand, in the 1980s, Afghanistan had a place at the University of Wisconsin campus. There were 3 Afghans and 2 Afghan studies students. You couldn't even have 1 student. I was an undergrad, 2 graduate students didn't get along. So the 3 Afghans, you could not have one. Then the hash, and then the sort of Islamic politics, all kinds of right on campus. I don't know how to reflect upon that meeting, but it's just a little vignette of industry.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, continue.
Yeah, I'm just really interested in the corporate shell sense of sort of documenting history and how one does. Because I think, for example, of the Saudi American Aramco oil and their magazine, which is kind of valuable in a sense. I don't know how much you thought. I mean, I find it useful. I don't feature it. I just look at it for the pictures. They're great pictures. Great pictures of camels. I mean, they do a lot of stuff with food. They do a lot of great stuff with the history of the Middle East. And I just wonder, I realize that's a kind of a marketing thing. But what does Shell do with their geography of control?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what motivated them to agree to make those graveyards accessible. But
the other ones didn't.
Yeah, the other ones never got back to the activists who reached out to them, because there's this kind of movement of people who were trying to preserve those monuments, essentially. And yeah, Shell responded. And Peter, I was thinking, Peter, didn't Shell ask you to come? Wasn't it Shell that asked you to come and talk that once?
It was Shell, yeah. Royal Dutch Shell. I
Maybe
think they're
they're
still called Royal Dutch.
What's that?
They were still called Royal Dutch, I think.
Right.
They changed their name.
What were they asking you to speak about?
I don't really know.
Climate change.
Yeah, but they wanted me to. I don't know why they. It was kind of a greenwashing thing, but I have no idea why they thought I would be useful to them for greenwashing. And then they asked to see my slides, and I was totally like, "You guys are fucking killing the planet." And then they just invited me, and it became like a little bit of a thing.
Yeah, so I don't know. My sense is just that Shell might be a little more responsive to like having a certain profile, right? But I don't think they're really committed to it.
I don't think they're.
Yeah,
I don't think their sense they're any different than anyone else. I mean, some of the BP likes to spend a lot of money on greenwash too. And anyway, I think they're all the same.
Well, Shell is protected because it's a shell company.
Yeah. Is it really? I mean,
The commercial, where they're trying to tout their energy efficiency.
I think they all do that pretty much.
There's a big push from one of the big oil companies.
Yeah, exactly.
ExxonMobil, the new ExxonMobil commercial.
They're all doing it.
they're all the same. You're right.
And they do things like they basically buy these infomercial spaces in the New York Times and lawyers, and they try to make it look like, it's an actual New York Times article. But they also give, the New York Times and lawyers and other outlets so much advertising money that we suspect that those news venues are, it affects their reporting essentially. It especially affects like editorial decisions in terms of like what they might run. So yeah. Stop opining.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Did you want to?
Yeah, just more on the mounds. The people who claim it as a part of their cultural heritage, those who are interested in the mountains, right? How are they organized? How do they advocate?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was kind of, I watched the documentary, it's like a little 10-minute, opt-out kind of thing or something like that. And I watched it many times. And it's hard to, because I think the story that they're trying to tell is fairly complicated. And so like trying to figure out the sourcing and the causality is sometimes difficult. But there are there's a museum called like the River Road Museum or something like that, where not Sharon and Berlin, there are two other activists, I think brother and sister Holland, I think is their last name, and they work, but no longer work. They used to work at the museum, and now they have some other job. And I think I'm not exactly sure how they became interested in it. I'm not sure if that was included, but yeah, it's these local activists who are interested in land use. And I know how it was. It's because they were funeral directors. There was I think again, a brother and a sister, possibly a husband and a wife, who owned a crematorium or a mortuary, and they started to, I guess, through that work, started to realize that there were all these unacknowledged graves around them of these enslaved people.
But it's not the sort of indigenous people whose graves.
It's enslaved people. Yeah, it's African migrants, forced migrants from Africa. Yeah, although there's a lot of mixing as well. And then this team, there's a younger woman in the OPDOC that speaks for that company called Forensic Architecture, and it sounded, from her origin story, it sort of sounded like she went to school in Louisiana. She grew up in Louisiana, went to school there, and was also kind of a community activist before she started this kind of analytical work. So I think it's a fairly local, locally grounded kind of initiative.
It's kind of an intellectual or historical motivation, not a cultural recovery or heritage.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that for the two funeral directors, it was like the realization that there were all these people who were the ancestors of the people that they were burying that were not being, their graves weren't available, and you couldn't go and mourn your ancestors, or you didn't have any access to it, and they were right there. They were just under the grounds within the purview of these huge petrochemical corporations, and under their they're holding ponds and they're all this kind of stuff. It's pretty horrific to see the images, but that's what's kind of interesting to me. It's like, because it makes sense to me, right, that you want that access to that land, and you want it to be undisturbed, or you want it to be treated in a way that's commensurate with what's happened there, right? Which is true for every place on the earth, right? There shouldn't be any place where it's okay to have a petrochemical refinery and that kind of thing, because all the land is sacred, because it's all made up of dead people and dead other kinds of creatures, or formerly alive. So yeah. Well, I feel like I don't like the word dead, because I do feel like there's an animacy. It's the de-animation and the desacralization of land and its own right to be defended and to not be exploited and have value extracted from it and circulated in all these ways that accumulate in the pockets of billionaires. So.
I mean, if I may, just on the subject of death, in the context of Afghanistan, there's
battle over death in a sense. You know, burial practices and sort of who's death who can make a shrine, or you know, the sort of question between Sufism or formal expressions of Islam on the one hand, sort of the question for burial and memorization of the dead. But then there's also the problem of the global war on terror and the killing that doesn't really provide the incineration of the mainly drone strikes that just don't leave anything there, and the cultural sort of anomie that it's just really an interesting thing.
Thank you for bringing this up, because I think I was having the thought when listening to you, Charlie, like actually what can quantitative data sets that are embedded in such coloniality tell us actually about politics of commemoration, right? Or the geopolitics of commemoration. And I was also thinking, is it even possible to have now, for lack of a better term, anti-colonial quantitative data sets? And I'm bringing this up because obviously most of the quantitative data and the numerical information in and on Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine is produced for these international organizations and NGOs, right? And then whose body counts, considering the bombs that we started the discussion with, right? And that are visible or not visible, is the big elephant in the room. And actually in 2 weeks, I've invited Imran Firuz, who is an Austro-Afghan journalist and who, because of the absence of any stories about people who have been killed in the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, what is today's Afghanistan and Pakistan, because of the drone warfare, he created, he tried to gather oral histories, but I mean, he is trained as a journalist, did these oral histories, also thinking again about access, right? Access to sources, and created a digital drone memorial. Often it's like an anonymous death, which also happened a lot actually throughout the 2 decades of war, that people could not be identified and no one claimed the bodies. So you have in Kabul loads of stones just like coming out of the ground with sometimes not even a name. But the stone kind of remembers that there was a breathing human. I'm sorry, I'm also just thinking out loudly about the city of the dead, right? The ways in which it sometimes in Kabul is delineated and honored. I'm thinking of the Sakhi Mosque, for instance, is like a place in West Kabul where you have a Shia site and basically a place where people come to for commemoration of a person, and then around it they have built a graveyard. And it's very differently organized compared to, for instance, the Jew-Christian cemeteries. And another thing is that you have these pop-up cemeteries throughout Kabul, like graveyards all over the city. Yeah, so I'm just thinking the ways in which politics of commemoration actually manifest for the occupied and colonized. The context of Palestine, of course, takes the conversation to a whole new level, right? When actually the whole Gaza Strip is turned into a cemetery. And is it then actually a cemetery? Like, what is it? Because in a cemetery, you have a dedicated, what I mentioned in Kabul, you know, there is a dedicated space for an individual human with past. But now, like in Gaza, it's just like, what do we even call it? I find like cemetery has some form of system to it, right?
Yeah. Organization, containment. Yeah.
Sorry, but yeah. So,
Yeah. You know, the other problem with death in Kabul is the pressure, the capitalist pressure on space. That I've just had to review an article with, you know, a submission about the difficulties that essentially mobile people, the Fugees, and the Japs in particular, are having problems finding space to bury their dead. They're not able to bury their dead.
Under the Islamic Emirate.
This is under the occupation. Yeah. Of real difficulties for the Japs in particular to be allowed to bury their dead.
Because graves are so
Spatial
expensive.
pressure. People are sort of guarding their own space, land grabbing, and the private defense of those holdings. So.
Well, no, I mean, I had one other thought about the silencing. So, Maria, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up that idea of silence. I don't know what else I can say about that. But no, I mean, I do think you touched on something there, which to me is that poem, the Terence Hayes poem, is about, well, I mean, I guess it is kind of about commemoration, and it's about the work of putting these things into words and the difficulty and the ambiguity, I guess, of that, or the ambivalence of that, right? Because that's what's making me pause over this poem in terms of whether or not I'm going to include it in this paper on necrogeorgic, because to me it feels, the poet, the speaker, whoever it is, feels hesitant to take up the work of putting it into cause and effect, or to making the entities cohere. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but thank you for that idea about that. And also the thing is, for Terence Hayes, like sonar, orality is super important, the way that the words sound and the way that it's a voice kind of coming out of nothing and saying something and turning, stinging. I mean, Terence Hayes often, he says in one of his American sonnets, For My Past and Future Assassin, in a minute I'll tell you how little poetry saves. But he also says, like, maybe this is from an interview, not from a poem, but like I write these poems to keep myself from jumping out of the window, right? Because it's like this, to give into silence or to accept the silence or whatever, and the erasure maybe that can entail is not acceptable. Right? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll forward you an article with the keyword on silence. What really affects us romantic sensibility towards like landscape and how that has to very specific ways of drawing the boundaries between what is alive and not alive. So I just thought it could help you like maybe just delve into that.
Okay, cool.
Now, just in the field.
Yes, thank you.
Not mine, someone else.
Yeah, but still, I appreciate the.
Talking about also resources and the ways in which even the terminology that Maria importantly highlighted around natural resources is not only embedded within coloniality, but also has been claimed in the process of nation state building, right? There's also there's multiple layers of violence in how we actually speak about natural resources. And in the context of Afghanistan, I was trying to make the links between Afghanistan, the Gulf, and then the occupation. There was no literature to speak to, so for instance, Aramco World emerged because they had in 2018 an issue on Firuz Ku. Firuz Ku, translated as Turquoise Mountain, is an NGO with a lot of profit-making elements, which has been founded by Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart is a Tory politician in England. Actually, yeah, I think he's from Rutland, which is like the smallest province in England, if I'm not mistaken, or New Cumbria, like one of the smaller ones. But he is a very well-known Tory/liberal whose dad worked in the MI6 and who was one of the first to write several books about like walking through Kurdistan and Afghanistan. And then, I mean, what I find intriguing is that he then goes on and builds this huge network of basically mobilizing artisanal handicraft and like, for instance, jewelry making, classical Islamic calligraphy, turning it into a commodity that then is shipped to Saudi and purchased by luxury hotels, right? And Aramco World then, for instance, covering these stories. So I was thinking, you know, and so, yeah, so that was one way in which the relation between empire also extends to the Gulf, right? And to oil, which is not really visible when you move through Muradkhane in Kabul, which is like one of the districts that they rebuilt. And they did amazing work, like cannot be denied. But basically, it also opened the space for a lot of white people who call themselves expats to then come to Afghanistan and very, very well paid jobs, like folks who after their service in Afghanistan and then ended up in, what's it called, the Smithsonian? Yeah, for instance. And these entanglements, I think, are really, really interesting, but also how do you talk about folks, and this includes myself, because between 2019 and 21, I was working in these institutions and organizations, right, that were part of the occupation. So many of the people who produced academic writing, right, and who were working, for instance, for Firuzku, and also doing a lot of consultancy work, though, then also ended up writing a lot about the cultural and literary history of Afghanistan, not rendering their actually entanglements with the US military-industrial complex, including the Anglosphere and Gulf, right, visible. So talking about your original question of actually access to sources, right, or inaccessibility to sources, and I'm thinking like it's a continuous struggle. Yeah, sorry, just sharing love.
Sort of trajectories of empire, outside of empire, outside of imperial.
And yeah, and what does this make an empire, right? So what's empire today if like the Saudis are also having a seat at the table? So I sometimes, I've been working a lot thinking more through like carceral capitalist states and systems, because I think maybe what we're just describing, right, is actually, I sometimes wonder, we know all what we mean by imperial world order, right? But also it's a very abstracted term. So how does this actually manifest in the present? And I think it's the carceral elements and then the profit generating elements can sometimes not be captured.
Yeah. I don't know if we have any, we haven't, I don't know if it's worth doing some attention to different kinds of empire. We kind of treated empire as a unitary, that sort of stuff. As we potentially move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I could follow on that question of moving forward. What are your thoughts?
What are your thoughts?
No, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I was thinking that I do think it would be fantastic to have more conversation, actually. I have more questions, for instance, also thinking about the connection between the war on drugs and the war on terror, and the ways in which relations often within Middle East and South Asia studies, they are raced, but we do not talk about them as race, right? Or we do not use the term race. It's just a really, really new discussion that has been emerging. Like MESA, for instance, the Middle East Studies Association, just had one panel 2 years ago for the first time on actually the presence of race in Middle Eastern studies, right? So, but what is it? So the presence of ethnicity and ethnic politics, what has it been coding, which needs a form of deciphering now from our end. And I don't know if we had enough time to think about these sort of questions as they manifest like in American studies as well as like in Middle Eastern studies, and the ways in which, considering that Middle East studies is a product of the US, these connections, I think there's so many nodal points that I'm not sure that we touched upon. So thinking about developing the special issue, I'm wondering, actually, yeah, open question for me, how to move ahead to deepen the conversation about how these papers actually speak to each other and what they invite us to ask.
Well, not all of them, it's clear, are about Middle East,
Yeah,
South
yeah,
Asian, and
yeah.
African studies.
Yes.
So
Some-
I don't know if that
some-
matters.
Oh, no, of course. Actually,
And,
like,
and I'd also know, you know, especially for junior colleagues, to make them detour from the path they're already working on to try to make a coherent thing might be extra work. That is not a good use of their time.
No, like the thoughts about area studies are coming from my very personal vantage point.
But also, so we talked about interconnections,
Mm.
but if those interconnections may be beyond the research trajectory of some of our colleagues who you know, they're making their careers by focusing on their top pension. So, you know, war on drugs everywhere or comparative views everywhere doesn't necessarily help them. I mean, or maybe it would help give them a new audience, but I think that would be a decision for them to make. And we have such a huge variety of disciplinary and other kinds of approaches, which is very exciting to listen to, but might be challenging for a journal.
Although by the same token, I was also thinking that the organization of data sets, well, I don't know how this, I'm also kind of tired. I like sort of get less coherent by this time of day, so I apologize in advance, but you know, those are the disciplinary boundaries too, right? There are these ways in which we assume there are certain structures sort of baked in by the assumption that we are kind of in different, that the disciplinary boundaries are stable kind of, or something like that. I don't know if there's a way to frame it as something that's more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, or that part of what it's inquiring about is what makes up what's important about the structural features of our different vantage points, or something like that. But yeah.
Maybe also like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but also antidisciplinary.
Right.
You know?
Yes. Sure.
Like
Yeah.
maybe actually think, like talking about entanglements, considering that we often are within, but also speaking against, like area studies. I think it just shows that the necessity to have intrinsically inter and antidisciplinary projects, right, in the future, to even render ecological issues visible within the context of empire building. Like it requires such a bigger set of knowledges than like how, you know, the classical Orientalists used to be trained, right? Like here you learn a language and like Islamic studies, there you go, you know? So I'm thinking now that, for instance, the category of race is becoming more salient also in different area studies that try to actually speak to the international. What does this?
You're bringing in a lot of issues here.
Yeah.
Which is great for conversation, but maybe difficult for writing.
But like, yeah, I'm thinking a journal like Comparative Africa, South Asia, and Middle East Studies actually gives the intellectual leeway to ask those questions about, you know, maybe the future of the non-existent, like.
Would you want each of the papers then to touch on all of these issues? I think the keywords we've hit on are imperialism, environment, war, violence, silencing, I love the topic, race now, neoliberalism, capital. I mean, do all the papers have to have a paragraph on each of these?
No, I don't think so. I think they maybe allude to, and this is also like, I mean, I don't know, do you want to?
I mean, it feels like they're all kind of integral to what I've heard, at least, of what we're doing. So maybe it's there implicitly without being addressed overtly, you know? It's informing the approach. Or again, it can be sort of kaleidoscopic, that the terms sort of come in and out of view. It seems like they're these central concerns that each of us are addressing, some of them with more explicitness or emphasis, but they're all important to the work that we're all doing. So.
Actually, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your consciousness of your executive younger stuff. I've rarely heard such kindness.
Even awareness.
Yeah, so I think that's great. And I appreciate it. But I have to say, sometimes in my American experience, those side hustles or side tracks or whatever you want to call them can be extremely valuable to the members. In that sense.
If they have the brain space to do it, it can.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain space. Yeah. And time.
I mean, that gets back to, I think, your leadership is extremely inclusive and participatory, and maybe it works that way, but maybe a stronger hand is going to be needed to herd these cats towards a collective project, if that's going to happen. I, for one, am happy to continue conversations on all these projects are interesting, and I got to meet people and hear about things I wouldn't otherwise. This is a very well spent day for me. And if you were to convene, for example, a conversation either in person or hybrid or something, to follow up where we could distribute writings, give ourselves some time to think them over, and then to think sort of collectively towards something where they would speak to one another perhaps more cohesively. But I think also your guidance as to what you were reading into all of these, and feedback for each of those from you would be really welcome. And at various points, people might drop back, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Absolutely, I agree.
That would happen.
That's right.
I do think that like some themes such as neoliberalism, capitalism, fascism, ecology is manifested differently in like environmental issues in all the remarks, but there was something about actually the neoliberal age that I think ran, if I'm not mistaken or reading too much into it, through all the remarks. I'm not sure if, like, I do not think that war as an analytic was necessarily as, like, for instance, I think Miguel's. Yeah, sorry. So like a lot of
So I
open
thought
question.
war
was
was there, and the ways in which we talk on foreground violence, call it war, don't call it war, all those things I thought were there in so many of these things, and even more than capitalism and neoliberalism. I mean, the one I'm talking about, first of all, I'm sorry that I didn't do anything ecological, and it's not really part of this project. The other thing is that I don't associate this with neoliberalism or capitalism. I think this is high modernism, and you saw the same thing on the Soviet side. I'm an expert on that. So I'm not associating data gathering, but
It
it doesn't
apply to
have
your
to
paper, right?
necessarily, you know, the theme doesn't have to go to every single touch, or all the themes don't have to touch all the papers necessarily.
True.
But it does sound like you are working with a whole bunch of these key concepts and their interrelation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.